Okay, everything's live.
Yep, I synced on the YouTube channel as well.
Okay, Leanne, I believe we have a good number here. I think we can go ahead and get started if we're ready.
Yes, I think we're ready.
Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. I'm Aaron Yao. I'm the designated federal officer for the CASAC PM panel. In my role as DFO, I would like to formally open this public meeting. The CASAC is an independent expert federal advisory committee chartered under the authority of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. The CASAC is empowered under the Clean Air Act to provide independent advice to the EPA administrator on the scientific and technical bases for EPA's national ambient air quality standards. FACA and EPA policy require that CASAC meetings be announced to the public in the Federal Register and that substantive deliberations and interactions with EPA and the public be conducted in open sessions where DFO is present to ensure that the requirements of FACA are met. Today's meeting will be for the panel to receive briefings from EPA on the draft supplement to the 2019 Integrated Science Assessment for PM and the draft PM policy assessment. The panel will have another meeting on December 17th through 19th and December 1st through 2nd to deliberate on the charge questions and to peer review the ISA supplement and PA. There will be an opportunity for oral public comments on November 17th. As noted in the Federal Register, members of the public wishing to provide oral public comments should contact me by November 10th to be placed on the list of public speakers. Written public comments will be accepted throughout the advisory process, but to have greater consideration by the panel prior to deliberations, they should be submitted to me by November 10th. Minutes of today's meeting will be prepared to summarize discussions and action items in accordance with requirements of FACA. I will work with the chair to certify the minutes and have them posted on the CASAC website. The CASAC consists of special government employees appointed by EPA to their positions. As government employees, the members are subject to all applicable ethics laws and implementing regulations. The SAB staff office has determined that advisors participating in this meeting have no financial conflicts of interest or appearance of a loss of impartiality under federal ethics regulations relating to the topic of this meeting. For those on the phone, I would like to note that we have a live video webcast of this meeting. To access it, you can go to the CASAC website, casac.epa.gov, then click on the October 14th CASAC PM panel meeting, and you should see the link there to the live video webcast. To those watching the live video webcast, please send me an email indicating your attendance. However, if you've previously requested a call-in number, you do not need to email me again. I would now like to turn the meeting over to Mr. Thomas Brennan, Director of the SAB Staff Office, and then over to Dr. Leanne Shepard, Chair of the CASAC.
Thank you, Aaron. I'd like to welcome everyone who's participating, watching, and listening to this CASAC PM panel meeting. Thank you to the members of the panel for their public service and for taking time out of your professional lives to do this important review. I'd also like to thank the staff and management from the Office of Research and Development and the Office of Air and Radiation for all the hard work it took to get us to this point today. Finally, I'd like to thank my staff for all the content and logistical work that they've done to organize and host this meeting, with a special thanks to Aaron Yao, who's our DFO for the CASAC. Thank you, Aaron. With that, I'm just going to hand it right off to our chair, Dr. Leanne Shepard. Take it away, Leanne.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Aaron, and welcome to everyone. My name is Leanne Shepard, and I'm the Roman Haas Endowed Professor at the University of Washington School of Public Health and Chair of CASAC. I'm honored to serve EPA and the public in the support of the Clean Air Act. So the first thing I was going to do was review the agenda, and there will be opening remarks by EPA leadership. We will stop promptly at 10 after in order to invite Administrator Michael Regan to join us. And actually, I see that he is actually already here. So I think I will pause my review of the agenda and pick that up after we invite him to speak. So we are delighted today to have joining us the EPA Administrator, Michael S. Regan. Administrator Regan was sworn in as the 16th Administrator of the EPA on March 11th, 2021. Prior to his nomination as EPA Administrator, Mr. Regan served as the Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. Previously, he worked at the Environmental Defense Fund and at EPA, where he began his career. Administrator Regan is a graduate of the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University and earned a master's degree in public administration from the George Washington University. Please join me in welcoming Administrator Regan for some introductory remarks.
Well, thank you, Dr. Shepherd, for that introduction, and thank you for your leadership. You know, it's great to be here. I thank you all for the opportunity to speak at the first public meeting of this Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee Particulate Matter panel. From the very beginning of my time as administrator, I committed to ensuring that science would serve as the backbone of everything EPA does to protect people and the environment from pollution. Science is the reason Americans have cleaner air and live longer lives. It's the reason we have cleaner rivers and safer water to drink. And it's the reason we have a fighting chance against the environmental and public health challenges that lay before us, from climate change to PFAS pollution to environmental justice. Within the first week in office, President Biden issued a presidential memorandum on scientific integrity. In that memo, he made clear that his administration will prioritize making evidence-based decisions guided by the best available science and data. Those will be the words and actions that we live by as we pursue our work to tackle climate change, to advance environmental justice, to safeguard our drinking water, and to protect our families from harmful pesticides and toxic chemicals. In June, I announced that EPA would reconsider the previous administration's December 2020 decision to retain the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for particulate matter, which were last strengthened in 2012. EPA is reconsidering that decision because available scientific evidence and technical information indicate that the current standards may not be adequate to protect public health and welfare as required by the Clean Air Act. The CASAC and PM panel will play a critical role in making sure we get these PM standards right. I will rely on all of you and your expertise to ensure we ground our decisions in the best available evidence. The most vulnerable among us are most at risk from exposure to particulate matter. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to take a hard look at these standards that haven't been updated in nearly a decade. This summer, EPA released a report on climate change and social vulnerability in the United States, which concluded that race plays a significant role in determining one's risk of exposure to air pollution, even after controlling for other socioeconomic and demographic factors. Exposure to particulate matter can be particularly deadly. Earlier this year, researchers from the University of Illinois at Urbana released a study showing that Black Americans and other people of color are exposed to disproportionately higher levels of particulate matter. The researchers also found that all major emission categories, including industry, light-duty gasoline vehicles, construction, and heavy-duty diesel vehicles, contribute to the systemic disparities in PM exposure experienced by people of color in both urban and rural areas. These scientific studies are critical to pinpoint and define the causes of these disparities. But it's also critical that we listen to and heed the lived experiences of people in these pollution-burdened communities as well. That's why I believe that science and environmental justice must go hand in hand so that we can truly fulfill EPA's long-standing mission to protect all human health and the environment. We must be explicit about the full meaning of the essential mission, recognizing that our responsibilities are to protect the health and environment of all people and all communities, especially those historically marginalized, overburdened, underserved, and living with the legacy of structural racism. I encourage the CASAC and the PM panel to consider these disparities as you conduct your scientific review of EPA's work. Achieving environmental justice must be our collective task. And in closing, we are here today because of our commitment, all of our commitment to protecting human health and the environment. We can only achieve this mission if we build a strong foundation of science and then act on it. So I want to thank all of you for your willingness to serve on the CASAC and the PM panel, for your hard work in the coming months and your dedication to ensuring our science is of the highest quality. Thank you all so much for your service.
Thank you very much, Administrator Regan. That was very inspiring to hear from you, and we really appreciate your thoughts and your advice.
Thank you.
So I think I will move on now to invite Dr. H. Christopher Frey, Assistant Administrator for Science Policy at the Office of Research and Development. Dr. Chris Frey is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Science Policy at the Office of Research and Development. Prior to joining EPA, Dr. Frey was the Glenn E. and Phyllis J. Futrell Distinguished University Professor at North Carolina State University. He has served on numerous CASAC panels and was chair of the CASAC from 2012 to 2015. Dr. Frey has a BS in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Virginia, a Master of Engineering in Mechanical Engineering from Carnegie Mellon University, and PhD in Engineering and Public Policy from Carnegie Mellon. And those of us who have served on CASAC before, Dr. Frey is well known to us in his role as former chair. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Leanne. And it's such an honor to speak to the CASAC and the Particulate Matter Review Panel. And the administrator sets a high bar, as you can see. He's always inspiring, and it's a real honor to work with him on the leadership team here at EPA. As Leanne mentioned, I'm a former member and chair of CASAC, but I'm also a senior leader in the Office of Research and Development. And I want to thank the staff in ORD who have prepared the draft supplemental ISA that you'll be reviewing, which is a result of tremendous hard work and leadership and commitment from our scientific staff. And I also want to extend my thanks to our partners in the Office of Air and Radiation who have prepared for you the draft policy assessment. And as those of you who have worked on CASAC before know that there's a partnership between ORD to provide the scientific foundation, and then OAR interprets that science to develop policy recommendations. As Leanne mentioned, I've served on a number of review panels. In fact, I've served on 10 review panels for all criteria pollutants, and I've chaired 3 of them. And I will say, I don't recall an administrator coming to any of my CASAC meetings. And I think you heard in his opening remarks, the sincerity of his commitment to scientific integrity and the role of best available science to inform decisions. And that's the culture of this leadership team and of the agency as a whole. This is just our DNA. In the many hours you will spend reading draft documents and participating in meetings and drafting your individual comments and contributing to consensus responses to charge questions and contributing to and editing your letter to the administrator, please keep in mind that this is a very high level and significant form of public service. And it truly will inform the administrator as he later makes his decisions on the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Based on my years of experience with CASAC, I thought it would be helpful to share some suggestions that I have. One of my first suggestions is, if you haven't already done this, read sections 108 and 109 of the Clean Air Act and read the CASAC charter, and also read the legislative requirements that are set forth in the draft policy assessment, which gives a lot of legal and policy and technical history on the role that you have now. If you have any questions, I highly recommend your designated federal officer, Aaron Yao, who I've worked with for many years. He's highly experienced, and either he can answer your question or find folks who can. I recommend that you ask as many clarifying questions as you need to regarding the purpose and scope of the documents that you are reviewing. These documents are, as the administrator indicated, for your review, but they're also intended to inform his decision as well as your advice to the administrator. I recommend that you read prior CASAC advice regarding similar documents, such as the integrated science assessments and policy assessments. As far as why we're here now, as the administrator indicated, in March, he announced a decision to reestablish the membership of CASAC to ensure the agency receives the best possible scientific insight to support our work to protect public health and the environment. And furthermore, CASAC has returned to the time-proven practice of augmenting the chartered 7-member CASAC with additional experts to form the particulate matter review panel, which has the needed breadth, depth, and diversity of expertise, experience, and perspectives to provide advice on the many issues that pertain to your activity. A call for nominations for candidates for the chartered CASAC was published in the Federal Register in April. Nominees were subject to public comment. On June 17th, the administrator announced the 7 members of the chartered CASAC. And then subsequently, there was a call for nominations for candidates to the PM specific panel on June 25th. Those nominees were subject to public comment, and the members of the panel were appointed by the Science Advisory Board staff office at the end of August. The administrator mentioned that the agency, under his leadership, has announced its decision to reconsider the 2020 particulate matter NAAQS final action. And in support of this reconsideration, EPA has developed a supplement to the 2019 Integrated Science Assessment and a revised policy assessment. The draft ISA supplement and the draft PA will be reviewed by you at public meetings in November and early December, as Aaron indicated. And the public will have opportunities to comment on these documents during the CASAC review process and to further comment during the subsequent rulemaking process. With regard to the supplemental ISA, I strongly recommend that you read the 2015 preamble to the ISAs. This document sets forth the weight of evidence causality determination framework that's employed by EPA. The 2019 Integrated Science Assessment is a comprehensive evaluation and synthesis of policy relevant science, quote, and I'm quoting from Section 108 of the Clean Air Act, useful in indicating the kind and extent of identifiable effects on public health or welfare, which may be expected from the presence of a pollutant in ambient air. This policy relevant science is often referred to as the, quote, scientific criteria, unquote, or simply the criteria. The ISA communicates critical science judgments of the health and welfare criteria for particulate matter and serves as the scientific foundation for the review of the primary and secondary particulate matter NAAQS. The 2019 ISA is a final document. You are not being asked to review that document. However, the 2019 final ISA serves as the context and foundation for the draft ISA supplement. So I'm sure you're going to want to read the 2019 ISA. The evidence provided within the 2019 ISA, along with the targeted identification and evaluation of new scientific information in the draft ISA supplement, provides the scientific basis for the reconsideration of the 2020 particulate matter NAAQS. Sorry. So the draft ISA supplement focuses on evaluation of policy relevant studies published after the literature cutoff date of the 2019 ISA. In particular, the focus is on studies that could either further inform the adequacy of the current NAAQS or address scientific topics that have evolved since the 2019 ISA. And the draft supplement focuses on health effect categories with the strongest causality determinations that are presented in the 2019 ISA because those are the most policy relevant. Because the draft ISA supplement is intended for a particular purpose, I recommend that you keep this purpose in mind as you consider your comments. When I've chaired CASAC review panels, I've asked the panels to consider whether a draft document is adequate for its intended purpose. As a member of review panels, I've always found that public discussion with EPA staff has been helpful in understanding the choices that EPA authors made in the draft document and the feasibility of possible revisions that the panels might be contemplating. As you formulate your advice on the draft ISA supplement, I recommend asking the following. If EPA staff revise the document per our advice, will the resulting document be adequate for its intended purpose? And I'll note that while as scientists, we may naturally be curious regarding many interesting issues, the key focus here is on establishing the scientific criteria that are relevant to the policy assessment and subsequent decisions by the administrator regarding whether to retain or revise the NAAQS. I also want to address the causality framework. The 2019 ISA and the draft supplement are based on a framework for causality determination that is set forth in the 2015 preamble to the ISAs. EPA introduced an early version of that framework in 2008. Leading to the 2015 preamble, there were 6 NAAQS review cycles that engaged 66 different independent experts on CASAC and its review panels, as well as public comment at 14 different public meetings. As a result of CASAC input and public input, the framework evolved toward a maturation point as documented in the 2015 preamble. CASAC has generally supported the integrated evaluation of an overall body of work, inclusive of multiple lines of evidence. Further, CASAC generally has concurred with EPA staff regarding the approach for selecting policy relevant studies and recognized that staff typically are screening a large literature to those that are most policy relevant. It's also important to recognize the ISAs are an assessment of existing published peer-reviewed work. The National Academies are currently engaged in a study on assessing causality from multidisciplinary evidence base for the NAAQS. That is an ongoing study. But you'll notice that the draft ISA supplement includes recent peer-reviewed literature that represent advances in the state of practice regarding causal inference from epidemiological studies based on combinations of study design and analysis methods. Also, both the EPA staff and the CASAC may offer reasoned judgments consistent with requirements for the scientific criteria set forth in Section 108. As I mentioned earlier, I'm very grateful to EPA's hardworking staff for producing the draft documents for your review. And I'm very grateful to you, the members of the CASAC and the Particulate Matter Review Panel, for your commitment to the work that you're about to undertake. And with that, back to you, Leanne.
Thank you very much, Chris. A lot there to think about. I will move next to introduce Mr. Joseph Goffman. He's Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. He previously served as the Executive Director of the Environmental and Energy Law Program at Harvard Law School. Prior to that, he was Associate Assistant Administrator for Climate and Senior Counsel in the Office of Air and Radiation at the EPA. And he also worked on the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works as the Democratic Chief Counsel and Majority Senior Counsel. He holds a BA and JD degree from Yale University. So welcome, Mr. Goffman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shepard. And I'll be brief because I really hope that the inspirational words of Administrator Regan and the riveting and meticulous laydown that Chris Frey just shared really stick with you. I know they made a great impression on me. I want to sort of register 2 or 3 things. First, it really is a privilege to be able to talk to the CASAC and to such a distinguished group of scientists and experts whose distinction is complemented by your commitment to public service in the form of serving on CASAC. I should say that in my previous job, I was once working on a paper with a colleague, and in the course of suggesting an edit, my colleague blurted out to me, Joe, you're such a CASAC groupie. So you can imagine it's rather a privilege and a thrill to be able to be part of the opening of this meeting. I can't thank Chris Frey and Tom Brennan enough and their colleagues in the Office of Research and Development for the fabulous partnership they offer us in the Office of Air and Radiation, where we too have a team of truly gifted scientists doing the work that will be incumbent upon us to do to continue to implement the fine particle national ambient air quality standards going forward in the wake of the administrator's ultimate decision as he reconsiders the previous decision in setting the PM NACs. Of course, the stake of the Office of Air and Radiation is the stake of the mission of the entire EPA, which is to protect public health, including the health of at-risk groups. And the PM NACs has always been, throughout the history of this agency, the cornerstone of EPA's mission. As I'm sure you all know, there is an extensive, even huge body of evidence demonstrating the adverse health and welfare impacts of PM exposure. Since the very first standards for what were then called total suspended particulate, or TSP, were issued by the agency in the 1970s, our understanding of this class of pollutants has continued to evolve, and we have revised the NACs accordingly. We've made tremendous progress in reducing PM concentrations across the US and providing the resulting protections of public health and individuals from harmful PM exposures. But it does seem clear from a number of different perspectives that we still have more work to do. In light of the volume of new science before us and the public health imperatives of the decision that the administrator will ultimately make, I know that he is looking to you as are all of us to help in the evaluation of the evidence and provide advice about whether the current standards need to be revised and replaced. We place great value, the entire agency and certainly the administrator. Indeed, we depend on CASAC's thoughtful, detailed input. And we are grateful to have in place a special PM panel of 15 experts to assist the CASAC in this endeavor. Together, CASAC and the PM panel can really shed critical light on every important aspect of the science and provide the type of advice the administrator needs to make a decision of this magnitude and of this consequence. We are also aware that the clock is ticking. It's imperative to move forward quickly to ensure protection of public health and the environment. And as I said at the beginning, we are eternally grateful for the expertise and the dedication that you have committed to serve in the role that you are individually and collectively serving. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. de Goffman. So I'm going to move now to a very quick overview of the agenda, and then I'll invite the CASAC panel members to introduce themselves. Just broadly speaking, we'll have a combined presentation from EPA, from Office of Air and Radiation and Office of Research Development that focuses on the national ambient air quality standards, the review process, approach, and schedule. Then we'll hear from the Office of Research and Development about the draft PM Integrated Science Assessment Supplement. And finally, we'll hear from the Office of Air and Radiation about the draft PM Policy Assessment. The CASAC panel has the opportunity to ask clarifying questions after each of these presentations, and we will also take breaks as we need to. And now I would like to invite the CASAC panel members to introduce themselves. We will do brief introductions only, just name and affiliation, and we'll go in the order of the names listed at the end of the agenda, starting with the members of the Chartered Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. So with that, I ask members of the panel to turn on their video when they introduce themselves, if at all possible. And with that, I invite Michelle Bell to start. Michelle, you're muted.
Oh, I'm already having trouble. Sorry, everyone. Thanks. Hi, I'm Michelle Bell. I'm at Yale University at the School of the Environment with secondary appointments at the School of Public Health and the Environmental Engineering program. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And next is James Boylan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jim Boylan. I'm the Assistant Branch Chief at the Georgia Department of Natural Resources Air Protection Branch. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Next is Judy Chow.
Hi, everyone. I'm Judy Chow. I'm a research professor at the Desert Research Institute. It's nice to be back to CASAC.
Thank you. And next is Mark Frampton, but I think he may not be on right now. He was only going to be able to attend part of the meeting. Are you here, Mark? Okay, we'll move on to Christina Fuller.
Hello, my name is Dr. Christina Fuller, and I'm an associate professor at Georgia State University in the School of Public Health. Very pleased to be here and to serve.
Thank you. And next is Alexandra Panet Gonzalez.
Good morning. My name is Alexandra Panet Gonzalez. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the University of North Texas. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Moving on to members of the panel, Peter Adams is next, but he's not participating in the meeting today. So I invite George Allen to introduce himself.
Hi, George Allen, Chief Scientist at NESCOM in Boston, previous CASAC member and a member of the 2019 Independent PM Review Panel.
Thank you. Next is John Baums.
Hi, John Baums. I'm a physician scientist with appointments at the University of California, San Francisco, and the University of California, Berkeley School of Public Health.
Thank you. Next is Jane Clougherty.
Hello, I'm Jane Clougherty. I'm an associate professor at Drexel University, Dornsife School of Public Health, Department of Environmental and Occupational Health. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. Next, we have Deborah Corey-Schlechter.
Hi, I'm Dr. Deborah Corey-Schlechter. I'm a professor of environmental medicine, pediatrics, public health sciences, and neuroscience at the University of Rochester Medical Center. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Terry Gordon.
Hi, I'm Terry. I'm at NYU School of Medicine, do air pollution research. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Mike Kleinman.
Hi, I'm Mike Kleinman. I'm a professor in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health at the University of California, Irvine, and I'm the co-director of the Air Pollution Health Effects Laboratory there.
Thank you. Next is Stephanie Levinsky-Desir.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Levinsky-Desir. I'm the Chief of Pediatric Pulmonology at Columbia University Medical Center in New York City.
Thank you. Jennifer Peel.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Peel. I'm a professor of epidemiology at Colorado State University and Colorado School of Public Health. Thank you.
Thank you. David Rich.
Hi, my name is David Rich. I'm an associate professor of public health sciences, environmental medicine, and pulmonary critical care medicine at the University of Rochester Medical Center.
Thank you. Jeremy Sarna.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Jeremy Sarnat. I'm on faculty in the Department of Environmental Health at Emory University.
Thank you. Next, we have Neetha Thacker.
Hi, everybody. I'm Neetha Thacker. I'm at University of California, San Francisco. I'm in the School of Medicine and the Department of Epi and Biostats. Glad to be here.
Thank you. And now Barbara Turpin.
Hi, I'm Barbara Turpin. I'm professor and chair of environmental sciences and engineering at the Gillings School of Global Public Health at UNC Chapel Hill.
And now we have Mark Weisskopf.
Yes, hi, I'm Mark Weisskopf. I'm professor of environmental health and epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health.
Thank you. And Corey Ziegler.
Hi, I'm Corey Ziegler. I'm an associate professor of statistics and data science at the University of Texas at Austin and Dell Medical School.
Thank you. I don't think I missed anyone today. Is that right? Okay, we'll move now to the next item on the agenda, which is to invite Dr. Erica Sasser of the Office of Air and Radiation and Dr. Steve Dutton of the Office of Research and Development to tell us about the PM National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the review process, approach, and schedule. So I invite you all to start your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Shepard. And it's great to be with everyone today. Let me start out by introducing myself and then allowing Steve to do the same thing. My name is Erica Sasser, and I am the director of the Health and Environmental Impacts Division within EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. So along colleagues in research and development, my group is responsible for the National Ambient Air Quality Standards Program and for ensuring that the administrator is equipped with both the science and the policy options and other information that may be relevant to determining which standards are requisite to protect public health and welfare. Steve?
Yeah, welcome everybody. And my name is Steve Dutton. I'm the acting director of the Health and Environmental Effects Assessment Division, which is within the Office of Research and Development Center for Public Health and Environmental Assessment. And I am really excited to be here today and thank our administrator for his opening remarks and Chris Spray and Mr. Goffman for their remarks as well and for taking the time out of their schedules to join us. And I'm honored to be here co-presenting this introduction with Erica. I think on the next slide, we actually have some, if we could advance to the next slide, we have some additional folks we'd like to acknowledge here. I'm joined by my branch chiefs, Chris Weaver and Jane Ellen Simmons. And also Mr. Jason Sachs, who many of you will recognize, not only from his leadership on the 2019 ISA, but he's also his international expertise in the field of air pollution epidemiology. So he will be presenting to you in the next presentation, but just really happy to be here representing this really important activity and the team that has pulled together to bring this to you today. Jason has pulled together a large team of folks who have helped him develop this, the document ORD is presenting to you today, and he will be acknowledging the rest of them who are all listening in later on in his talk. I did want to also acknowledge Sheila Igo and David Orland from our Office of General Counsel, who have given both Erica and myself a tremendous amount of support and advice throughout the next review process for PM. So Erica, I think I'm going to kick it back to you to get us moving.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And in addition to the folks that Steve mentioned who would be speaking, I do want to call out a few folks from the OAR side who will also be presenting to you this afternoon. Again, we have a very large team working on this effort, and I hope that you will get a chance to interact with all of them in the course of the discussions over the documents. But today we have just a few folks who will be presenting to you. So in addition to the people that Steve mentioned, you will be hearing from Karen Wesson, who is the group leader for the Ambient Standards Group. And then from the co-leads for the PM NACS policy assessment and rulemaking, who are Lars Perlmutt and Nicole Hagen. They will be presenting the later on this afternoon on the policy assessment specifically. And in addition, we have Elizabeth Chan, who is the lead on the PM risk assessment, including the new at-risk analyses that are part of that evaluation. So I hope that you will get a chance to ask them many questions, and we have other experts on the phone as well, depending on what you'd like to cover today. But let me, before we get into the content of the overview, let me just say, along with all of the speakers who have spoken, from the administrator to the acting administrator, assistant administrator Frey, and acting assistant administrator Joe Goffman and Steve, we are all aware of the amount of work that you put in to participating in any NACS review, and with PM in particular, with the volume of literature, the number of standards, the complexity of this effort. We know this is going to be a big effort for you, and we really appreciate the amount of time and energy and the commitment that you bring in agreeing to serve on this panel and as part of the core CASAC. So let me say thank you, and we will reiterate that many times over the course of our discussions. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. We look forward to your questions. There are many aspects of these documents that may not be 100% transparent. As much as we try to ensure that they are, sometimes there are things that don't make sense, and we hope that you will ask questions about why we did things the way we did, or why we came to the conclusions that we reached. Okay, let me then go on to the next slide just to hit the overview of what we're going to try to cover in this opening presentation. So we are going to spend a little bit of time on the statutory background. I think Chris Frey did a nice job of hitting some of the highlights, but we do think that this background is important for understanding the task that we collectively are embarking on here. Then we'll give you a brief sketch of the NACS review process, sort of orient you towards where we are in the overall scheme. We'll talk about the 2020 review and the conclusions that were reached in that review. And then, of course, we will focus on the reconsideration, the decision to reconsider, and then how we are approaching that effort, including the timeline. And there are some constraints on that timeline, so I do want to hit that at the end. Okay, let's go to that first background slide. So for those of you who have been on CASAC before, you have probably seen this slide or a version of this slide and the next one a couple of times. But we do think it's important to start the conversation with the parameters of the task. So, of course, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards Program covers 6 pollutants. And for each of those pollutants, Section 109 of the Clean Air Act specifies that we are to set both primary or health-based standards and secondary or welfare-based standards. Specifically, with regard to the primary standards, the Clean Air Act says that those standards shall be ambient air quality standards, which in the judgment of the administrator are requisite to protect public health with an adequate margin of safety. And obviously there are a lot of terms there which have some ambiguity in them. And as the program has evolved and as litigation has further shaped sort of interpretations of these terms, we have come to understand them in greater detail. And so we want to specify that when we say requisite, that means that the standards must be sufficient, but not more protective than necessary. And the Clean Air Act clearly does not require the elimination of all risk. And in fact, it would be impossible for many pollutants. Many of these are no threshold pollutants. So we recognize that it's not possible to set a zero risk standard. And that's not the goal of the program. But we are looking for a standard that provides an adequate margin of safety, which includes a margin of safety against effects that may not be identified yet, or where there is substantial uncertainty in the underlying evidence. In addressing the margin of safety requirement, we have to form a judgment, and the administrator's judgment takes into account a number of factors. Those factors include things like the nature of the health effects. How severe are those effects? How many people are affected? And to what degree are they exposed to these pollutants? And then how much certainty do we have around the types of effects that will occur following exposure? And one important aspect of this is that public health protection is intended for what we would consider adverse health effects. So in other words, the standards are not designed to prevent any impact. They're designed to protect against what we would call an adverse effect. And so we have to determine what is an adverse effect. And for many pollutants, that becomes an important part of the review that we spend time talking about, looking at how we determine what actually constitutes adversity for a given pollutant. Okay, and the second important point is that in setting these standards for public health, we are focused on sensitive groups, at-risk populations. And who those groups are is going to depend on which pollutant we're talking about, but oftentimes it is groups that have underlying respiratory or cardiovascular conditions, groups of different ages, children, older adults, and that can range quite a bit across pollutants in terms of which groups we call out to focus on. It is also important to note that in protecting sensitive groups, we are not aiming to protect the most sensitive individual within that group. We are aimed at protecting the group as a whole. Okay, next slide, please. Switching gears to secondary standards, the Clean Air Act specifies that the secondary standards should specify a level of air quality, the attainment and maintenance of which, in the judgment of the administrator, is requisite to protect the public welfare from any known or anticipated adverse effects. And again, here I would highlight the word adverse as being important to our judgment. And I would note also that welfare effects is a very broad category. And you see listed here quite an array of different types of environmental effects that come into play. Soils, water, crops, vegetation, materials, animals, wildlife, weather, visibility, and climate. So it's a pretty wide range of effects that we're putting under that umbrella. The Clean Air Act goes on to specify that for both the primary and secondary standards, an independent review committee shall advise the administrator by reviewing both the underlying air quality criteria, the scientific criteria, and the standards themselves, and that scientific review committee shall recommend to the administrator any new standards or revisions of existing standards as may be appropriate. And of course, that function is served by you, the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, as further advised by the PM panel. Couple of final points in setting the NAAQS. We think about not just the level of the standard, but all of the dimensions of the standard. So that includes the form, the indicator, and the averaging time for each standard. And we look at all of those factors together in judging whether a standard is requisite. EPA is further required to engage in reasoned decision-making to translate scientific information into standards. This means, again, that we have to think about how to interpret uncertainty, how to interpret adversity, how to deal with areas where we may have very little data, and places where we know there's no threshold for the effects associated with a pollutant. Importantly, we are barred from considering the cost of implementing the standards. And this has been litigated all the way to the Supreme Court. And we have been instructed to focus solely on the health and environmental impacts and the level of impact that is considered adverse. So we do take cost into account, but that comes later in the process when we're thinking about how to implement a given standard. Furthermore, although we do evaluate background levels of pollutions for every review, we always, in the air quality chapter, we will always look at background levels and other contributions like international transport, try to parse out how much is coming from these different sources. In setting the standards, those background levels are essentially irrelevant. We decide what is requisite, and then we figure out how to deal with the concentrations that are monitored, and we factor background and other sources in at the implementation stage. Okay, let's move on to an overview of the process. And again, for many of you, I know that this is familiar territory, but I do think to make sure we're all on the same page, it's good to just spend a minute and orient ourselves here. There are always three main stages in a review. There is a fairly lengthy planning stage where we are scoping what may be needed in order to make sure we're encompassing all the literature and all the main categories of effects. And we do sometimes have workshops around that especially if there's uncertainty about how to scope a review. We always codify our plans in documents that come to the CASAC for review. And then we move, after we solidify our plans, we move into an assessment phase. And that is sort of the middle component, probably the longest phase of the review is this assessment phase, where we compile both the integrated science assessment and then the policy assessment. We do also, for most reviews, conduct quantitative risk and exposure assessments. Those sometimes are standalone documents and sometimes they're folded into the policy assessment. We generally find that putting the quantitative assessment in the context of the policy options helps everyone process what the risk assessment results mean. So we've increasingly moved to a model where the risk and exposure information is contained within the policy assessment or released at the same time. So the first two parts, the phases in green here, all of the documents that we produce are reviewed by the CASAC and the panel. So that is, and they're also reviewed by the public. So there's always opportunity for public comment. And all of that information, all of the feedback from the CASAC and the public is then folded into the rulemaking phase. Rulemaking phase usually takes about 18 months. And that includes both a proposed decision with a public comment period, public hearings, and then a final decision. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to hand it over to Steve to talk about the ISA.
Thank you, Erica. So I'll take a couple minutes here to describe the integrated science assessment. So again, as Erica mentioned, many of you are familiar with the ISA, but I do want to give a little bit of background here for what the purpose of the ISA is in general. And then you'll hear a little bit more in detail around specific to particulate matter in our next presentation from Jason Sachs. So the ORD's responsibility is to produce the integrated science assessment, or the ISA. And this is the document that outlines and the scientific criteria or the scientific information that's available to inform the next review. So the ISA is a comprehensive evaluation and synthesis of the most policy relevant scientific information. It includes information on the individual air pollutant sources, transport, transformation, deposition, and fate, dosimetry, and then ultimately information and conclusions about health and welfare effects. Those conclusions are drawn for the health and welfare effects in the form of causal statements. So you'll hear a little bit more in the next presentation about those causal statements that were drawn for particulate matter. And as you heard from Dr. Frey at the opening of this meeting, that process for developing an ISA, and in particular, the framework we have in place for developing those causal statements, is described in the preamble to the ISA. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. We also have a characterization in the ISA for at-risk populations and for specific dose or concentration response relationships, which may help inform the quantitative risk and exposure assessments conducted by the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards that you'll hear about on the coming slides. So the process for developing an ISA has been refined over many, many years and is described, as I mentioned, in the preamble to the ISA. And that's where this figure that's up on the screen here comes from. Each box in this figure represents a step in our development process, and there's a lot more details behind those available to you in the preamble. We start with a kind of a description of our approach for gathering the literature search and selection process, and for evaluating individual study quality for the studies that we identify. We then go into a developing initial sections of the ISA, and we present those to independent peer review committee that we formed just in ORD to help make sure we're capturing all the pertinent and relevant information, make sure we're not missing any studies, and that we're characterizing things appropriately. Once we have that all pulled together, then we start to develop our evaluation and synthesis and integrate the findings. And it's really important here to note that the ISA is an integrative document looking across multiple lines of evidence. So we're not just looking at any one line of evidence, we're really looking across lines of evidence to draw our conclusions. And once we have that pulled together in draft form, as Erica mentioned, all of our next documents go to the CASAC, this panel here today, for your input and review. So the draft ISA in the case of the particulate matter review, the 2019 ISA was finalized in December of 2019, but it went through the full CASAC review prior to being finalized. We also have many opportunities for public comment throughout the process. So as I mentioned, the ISA for PM was finalized in December of 2019. And this process for developing an ISA it has been evolved over years with much input from CASAC and from the public. And as Chris Frey mentioned, in 2015, things had kind of gelled enough, and the process was developed enough and refined enough that we developed the standalone preamble where it's described. And I will point out, though, that the process, we're continuously looking for ways to improve our transparency and clarity in our work. And actually, today's meeting is an example of how we're trying to improve that clarity and transparency and interaction with CASAC and the public. We're actually engaging with you, a month and a half earlier than we normally would, and taking this opportunity to present to you the documents that you will be reviewing later in November and December, and kind of trying to share our reasoning behind the approach that we use for developing these documents. So that's kind of one example of how we're trying to test out new procedures and new processes to improve the next review. With that, I think I'm going to we can shift to the next slide, and I'll hand it back over to Erica, who's going to talk through the next document in the process.
Great, thanks, Steve. Yeah, so I'm going to talk next about the risk and exposure assessment and the policy assessment. And just building off what Steve just said, I think we want to emphasize that as we move forward from the science to the policy, increasingly we have tried to tailor the assessments to fit the situation, to fit the pollutant, to fit the level of information at hand, the level of certainty that we have, and to make sure that we are presenting analyses that are most useful both to the case administrator in understanding the potential impacts on the standards. So this slide talks about the risk and exposure assessment. And, for most reviews, we do conduct a risk assessment. In some cases, that also includes an exposure assessment. And the design of those assessments is going to depend on the pollutant and the types of information that we have at hand. And so you can see here that in the current review for PM, for example, we are focused principally on using ambient concentrations related to concentration response functions from the EPI literature to develop quantitative estimates of risk. And sort of as you move across the diagram, the types of work that we do change depending on whether we have other information. So for example, for ozone, we have focused more on mapping exposure patterns as an additional step in estimating risk. And for a pollutant like lead, we have to consider other types of effects, such as multimedia effects, and think about biomarkers that are intermediate biomarkers like blood lead levels, and translating those into IQ loss. So there are more steps essentially and more complexity in an assessment for a pollutant like lead than there is for a pollutant like PM. So the results from these assessments, as I said earlier, can be either in a standalone document, which would be a risk and exposure assessment, or they can be reflected in the policy assessment. And increasingly, we've moved towards that model. Sometimes we have lengthy appendices, which also provide more of the quantitative results and potentially side analyses that we may have done, but we focus on the core of the analysis for informing the standard options. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. And so then all of that information, both all of the detailed synthesis that comes out of the integrated science assessment and the quantitative risk information is pulled together into the policy assessment, which has essentially one purpose, which is to answer the two questions at the bottom left here. First question is, does the available information and quantitative evidence call into question the adequacy of the existing standards? And if so, second question is, what potential alternative standards should be considered? So the policy assessment is a framework by which we attempt to break down in a very systematic way the answers to those questions. And the diagram on the right-hand side here essentially just captures that visually. If we see, based on what we see in the ISA combined with the REA information, that there is a reason to consider revising, then we would lay out alternative standards for consideration and discussion. If we feel that the existing information does not call into question the adequacy of the current standards, we would not lay out alternatives in the policy assessment. And of course, CASAC is invited to comment on all of those judgments and the underlying assessments that feed into them. Okay, so then finally, next slide, please. We move into rulemaking, and I will just note that this is a very public-facing process, and we have extensive engagement with the interagency group, including OMB and all the other federal agencies that might have an interest in the decision. And of course, we also have very extensive public engagement through hearings and a public comment period. And all of this information, along with the CASAC advice and the staff conclusions, are brought together to determine the final standard. Next slide, please. Okay, so for the 2020 review, I just want to briefly recap where we ended up in 2020, because that is, of course, the basis for the reconsideration. So the key documents in the 2020 review included an integrated science assessment completed in 2019 and a policy assessment completed in 2020 that contained the quantitative analyses. And the 2020 policy assessment reflected the judgment of at the staff level that the scientific evidence and information supported revising the level of the primary annual PM 2.5 standard to a level below the current standard, which is set at 12 micrograms. The policy assessment also concluded that it was appropriate to consider retaining the primary 24-hour standard, as well as the primary PM10 standard and the secondary standards. In reviewing that those draft conclusions, the CASAC reached a split decision. They did not reach consensus. And I think an important note here is that, of course, the CASAC did not have access to a PM panel. The PM panel was disbanded, and the CASAC was 6 members for most of this review, actually. But they did have access to a pool of consultants who were available to respond in writing to questions that individual CASAC members wanted to submit to them. So it was a very different model. And the CASAC was unable to reach consensus, which is not, there are other circumstances and times where that has happened, that the CASAC does not reach consensus. And we always hope for consensus because it makes our understanding the CASAC's advice easier, but it is of course quite possible that there would be divergence of opinions among a group of 22 experts in your case here. So just briefly there, the CASAC in their summary letter said that some members concluded that the draft PM policy assessment does not establish that any new scientific evidence and data reasonably call into question the public health protection afforded by the current PM standards, while other members concluded that the weight of the evidence, particularly reflecting recent EPI studies showing positive associations between fine particles and health effects at estimated annual average concentrations below the current standard, does reasonably call into question the adequacy of the current PM standards to protect public health with a margin of safety. So the CASAC advice was on the primary annual standard. They did reach consensus on the other standards, including consensus advice to retain the 24-hour PM 2.5 standard and the primary PM 10 standard, as well as the secondary standards. In their letter, importantly, the CASAC also noted that they felt they lacked the expertise to thoroughly evaluate all of the evidence in front of them. And they specifically additional needed for CASAC to provide a thorough review of the PM NACS documents and they recommended that the administrator consider reappointing a PM panel, either the one that had been disbanded or a panel with similar expertise. Of course, the end of the whole process was that both the proposed and final decisions were to retain all of the current suite of PM standards. And in making that decision, especially on the fine particle standards, the administrator pointed to limitations in the evidence, particularly related to epidemiologic evidence. And he also noted uncertainty in whether more stringent standards would result in significant public health improvements. Okay. So here's where we are at this point, and we are looking at, this is the suite of standards that we have in place. Recap, last time any change was made was in 2012, where the annual standard was revised from 15 to 12. And this is the suite of standards that are subject to reconsideration now. And I'm going to let Steve introduce the reconsideration to the group.
Sounds good. So if we could move to the next slide. Erica just walked us through up to 2020, the decision to retain the standard. So I'm going to just walk through briefly what we already heard in a lot of the opening remarks from Administrator Regan, as well as from our senior leadership. In June of this year, the agency did announce its decision to reconsider the 2020 PM NACS final action to retain the primary standards that was just described to you by Erica. And this announcement recognized that the available science, evidence, and technical information indicated that the current standards may not adequately protect public health and welfare as required by the Clean Air Act. So we just heard from Erica that the 2020 PA concluded that the scientific evidence and information supported revising the level of the primary PM 2.5 standard to below the current level of 12 micrograms per cubic meter, while retaining the 24-hour standard and the PM 10 standard as well. So the agency also recognized that a significant accumulation of new scientific evidence had evolved since the cutoff date for the 2019 ISA, which was around January of 2018. So that's when we kind of cut off the literature and pulled together the final 2019 ISA. And so announced plans to develop a supplement that we will be presenting to you in the next presentation and that we will be reviewing in November, in full detail. And this is the supplement to the 2019 ISA. And so that will take into account the up-to-date new scientific information that's most relevant to the reconsideration. So next slide. The agency also announced its plans to review at this public meeting these documents. This meeting and the November and December meetings where we'll be actually be reviewing the documents. The draft PM supplement, as I described, will provide a targeted identification and evaluation of new scientific information on public health and non-ecological welfare effects. We have a little asterisk here to remind us that the ecological welfare effects, which are part of the Clean Air Act and are actually, for particulate matter, are being covered under a separate review, combined with oxides of nitrogen and oxides of sulfur. And that review is going on, but that's not within the scope of this particulate matter review, which is focusing on health and non-ecological welfare effects, such as visibility impairment, climate effects, and materials effects. So along with the 2019 ISA, the final ISA, this supplement will serve as the science foundation for the reconsideration. And likewise, the draft policy assessment, which you will also hear a lot more detail about later on this afternoon, will present an evaluation of the policy relevant aspects of the scientific evidence and quantitative exposure, risk, and air quality analyses, focusing on implications regard to the adequacy of the current standards and its appropriate potential alternatives. The announcement noted that the EPA expects to issue a proposed rulemaking in summer 2022 and a final rule by spring of 2023. We'll present at the end of this presentation a little bit more detail on that schedule. And following an open and transparent process for public review and comment. Let's switch to the next slide. I'm going to talk through half of this slide, describing the approach that we've taken at a high level in developing the ISA supplement. And then I'll have Erica speak to their approach at a high level for the policy assessment. So the 2019 ISA and the draft supplement together will serve as the complete scientific record for this reconsideration of the 2020 final decision. The supplement, as I mentioned, will update information and studies from the literature cutoff date of the 2019 ISA, which was around January of 2018. And it will build upon the scientific conclusions that are in that ISA and the causality determinations that were presented in that ISA. So we're hoping that you will use both of those documents throughout this review, and that we will be mostly focusing on the supplement, but in the context of all the conclusions and evidence that was presented in the 2019 PMISA. And you'll hear a lot more about that from Jason Sachs in the next presentation. So let me hand it back to you, Erica, to describe the PA.
Great, thanks, Steve. So unlike the ISA, for the PA, we have actually completely replaced the document. So the new draft policy assessment is a replacement for the 2020 PA, and I can provide a little more information about why we did that. Importantly, for effects where the draft ISA supplement has new information, the policy assessment incorporates that new information into the underlying record and into the preliminary conclusions. For those health and welfare effects where we did not have new scientific or technical information, the preliminary conclusions in the new draft policy assessment rely very heavily on the information that supported the conclusions in the last policy assessment. So there's less difference in those sections than in the ones where we had a lot of new information. But because the policy assessment is an integrative document bringing together all the threads, we felt it was important to knit everything together so that the CASAC could have, sort of a complete view of what we think the science and risk information means, where it leads us for the standards. And I think that you will see as we walk through the policy assessment presentation coming up, you will see that there are important ways in which we believe we have improved the policy assessment in terms of doing a better job of parsing through the air quality information that we rely on from the epidemiologic studies, and also in terms of evaluating risk and looking specifically at populations that may be at greater risk from PM exposures. And we'll talk through those analyses and evaluations in quite a bit of detail, actually, in the PA presentation. So I'm going to stop there. I do want to talk about schedule. I believe that's the last slide. If we can go to the next. Yes. Okay, in terms of timeline, we appreciate, again, the commitment of this group to this process and to the expedited timeline that we are working under. We have committed to have a proposed decision by next summer, which puts us under considerable time pressure. And the team has been working really hard at EPA to try to facilitate that by making these documents available to you as soon as possible. We know you haven't had to get them yet, or barely have had a chance to start. So we do anticipate that there will be a very robust discussion coming up in November and December. We will cover the ISA and the public comments during the November 17th to 19th dates. And we will cover the policy assessment on December 1st and 2nd. We hope that that will enable full discussion of both documents and full ample time for us to hear public comments, for you to hear public comments, and then to inform your final letter to us. We know that you will be working to put together your advice to the administrator and your letter and your individual comments. And we will fold all of that in then to our spring regulatory development process. So at some point this spring, we would envision issuing a final PM supplement and a final policy assessment. Of course, we don't have the dates yet. It partly depends on what we hear from you in terms of the amount of work that you think we have to do. And that would then lead pretty quickly to a proposed decision and a final decision by hopefully very early 2023. So let me stop there. I think maybe we're going to take some questions if the panel has any. Otherwise, we're going to move on to other presentations.
Thank you to Erica and Steve. That was very helpful. I invite panel members, if you have any clarifying questions, to ask them now. And I think you could just unmute your mic and speak, or you could raise your hand and Aaron and I will try to monitor that. Well, it looks like Erica and Steve, you did an excellent job and you were crystal clear. And at the moment, we have no clarifying questions. So I think we will move on to the PM ISA supplement and we'll take a break probably after that presentation. So I want to introduce Mr. Jason Sachs of the Office of Research and Development, who will be presenting the supplement to the Integrated Science Assessment.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Shepard, for that introduction. My name is Jason Sachs. I'm a senior epidemiologist in the Center for Public Health and Environmental Assessment. I'm the assessment lead for the particular matter integrated science assessment, as well as this supplement. Next slide, please. Although I'm the one up here giving this presentation, I just want to recognize the enormous team of both internal and external experts to the agency that contributed to both the development and the completion of the PM ISA. It was an enormous team, and without their unwavering support, it would not have been possible to even release the final ISA in December of 2019. Next slide, please. So while the focus of this presentation is on the development of the draft supplement to the 2019 PM ISA, in order to put the supplement in the proper context, I want to first walk through some of the key scientific conclusions of the ISA but also take a step back and touch on some of the steps of ISA development, and specifically those that were instrumental in the development of the PM-ISA. So these are some of the overall observations of the 2019 ISA. The first thing to keep in mind is that in the process of us working on any ISA, we conduct a broad systematic review of the literature. And so we want to try and cast the widest net as possible to make sure that we're not missing any of the key studies that we should consider in the process of developing the ISA. That resulted in us identifying about 320,000 references. Through various literature search techniques, we dwindled this down to about 7,000 that we read past the title and ultimately cited 2,800 in the ISA. The large majority of these studies were new studies that were published since the 2009 ISA, but it also encompasses those studies that were evaluated in previous at that point, air quality criteria documents. And so it really is the collective body of evidence building off previous assessments that we're evaluating within the ISA itself. With respect to PM 2.5, as I'm sure you can all imagine, this is where the most expansive body of literature resided. The studies that were published leading up to the 2019 ISA supported and extended many of the conclusions of the 2009 ISA. We did have a more extensive evaluation of some newer health effects categories, specifically nervous system effects and metabolic effects. And this allowed for us to make new causality determinations for some categories, PM size fractions and exposure durations that we had not in the past. And I'll touch on these in a couple slides. With respect to studies that evaluated the concentration response relationship, the evidence continued to support a linear no threshold relationship. And across the PM 2.5 studies, we saw that effects were occurring at ever lower long-term average concentrations. With respect to coarse particles, surprisingly, we had relatively fewer studies that were examining coarse particle exposures. And I say surprisingly because this was an uncertainty in the evidence base that we identified at the end of the 2012 NAAQS review. And we still had the same uncertainties that we did at the end of the completion of the 2009 ISA, specifically with respect to the methods used in epidemiology studies to estimate coarse particle concentrations. We had studies that would take the difference of PM10 minus 2.5. We had some that directly used dichotomous monitors to measure coarse particles. And because of the variability in concentrations and methods used, we didn't know how well correlated those methods are in estimating coarse particle concentrations, both spatially and temporally. And we still have those same uncertainties in the evidence base currently. For ultrafine particles, we had relatively fewer studies, and specifically the studies in the US are limited, mostly due to the fact that we don't have a monitoring network. The epidemiology studies that have been conducted to date are mostly using one monitor, and so we have limited information on the spatial and temporal variability of ultrafine particles. And that also factors into both the experimental and epidemiologic studies that have been conducted because of the inconsistency in how ultrafine particles are defined across the literature. We have variability in the size distribution that's being examined across studies, as well as the exposure metric that's being used, with some studies using number count, some surface area, some mass. And so it's really a challenge for us to assess the evidence base due to this variability in both exposure metric and size range that's being used for ultrafine particles. Next slide, please. And so this is the organization of the 2009 ISA. And I bring this up to make one key point with regard to what we've done differently in the 2019 ISA compared to previous ISAs. Previously, CASAC has suggested that a chapter we had devoted to mode of action was too far removed from the health effects discussion. And so we took that to heart, and in developing the 2019 ISA, we eliminated the mode of action chapter and moved that information into the health effects discussions. So for this document, we have chapters that are specific to each of the health effect categories for which we make causality determinations. And within those chapters, we have specific sections on each of the PM size fractions evaluated, as well as exposure durations. And so within each of those sections, we have a section on biological plausibility that's really focusing on each of the individual size fractions and exposure durations for the effects to lay out whether or not there's evidence that, that supports that the effects we're seeing in the epidemiology studies are biologically plausible. So that's one of the big differences in this document compared to previous ISAs up to this point. Next slide, please. So I wanted to orient you all on what the scope of the ISA was, because I think it's important to understand how we went about identifying the literature that we felt was most policy relevant and informative to making causality determinations. So within the ISA, we're tasked with answering a very specific question, and that is there an independent effect of PM on health and welfare at relevant ambient concentrations? And so to aid us in scoping the literature appropriately, we put specific criteria on the types of studies we were considering in the process of going through the literature. So for the health effects, the studies we considered were those that included a composite measure of PM. And we defined composite measure of PM as PM 2.5 mass, coarse particle mass, or some way to assess ultrafine particle exposure. So whether that's number concentration, surface area, or mass. We then further refined this when we're looking at the studies focusing on source-based exposures. And this is because, as I'm sure you're all aware, these exposures are a mixture of pollutants, and we're tasked with trying to identify what are the health effects due specifically to PM. And so in order for us to focus in on those types of studies, we said if a study looked at a source-based exposure, it also had to institute some approach to identify whether or not the effect that we were observing could be attributed to particulate matter. And so they had to include results with and without a particle trap. And then for studies that were looking at individual components, we also had additional criteria that said they had to include a composite measure of PM, as well as results for the individual components, so that we could relate the toxicity of the components to the current indicator, which is PM mass for each of the PM NAC standards. Additionally, for the health effects, we do focus on PM exposures, which we term as relevant to ambient concentrations. We've traditionally defined this as 1 to 2 orders of magnitude above ambient. And so this results in exposures that are less than 2 milligram per meter cube squared. Next slide, please. For the welfare effects, as Steve mentioned in his presentation, within the PM-ISA, we're focusing on the non-ecological welfare effects. And this is visibility effects, climate effects, and materials effects. And again, this is because we had the ecological effects due to the deposition of PM and PM components were considered within the oxides of nitrogen, oxides of sulfur, and particulate matter ecological criteria integrated science assessment, which was completed in 2020. Next slide, please. So Steve mentioned this a little in his presentation. I'm just going to touch on it in a little bit more detail in this one. Within the integrated science assessments, we're using a weight of evidence approach to assessing the causal nature of relationships between criteria pollutants and the health and welfare effects. This process provides transparency through a structured framework. We've applied it and used this same approach in all of the integrated science assessments to date for each of the criteria pollutants. The goal is to synthesize and integrate the evidence across the scientific disciplines, and then using that integration, or through that integration, then making conclusions on the overall weight of evidence using a 5-level hierarchy. That's ranging from causal relationship to not likely to be a causal relationship. Now, each level of the hierarchy is delineated, can you stay on that slide? There you go, thanks. Each level of the hierarchy is delineated by our ability to rule out with reasonable confidence chance confounding and other biases. We're also taking into consideration the doses and exposures at which these studies are conducted. And overall, we're assessing whether there's consistency of evidence within a scientific discipline, coherence of effects across scientific disciplines, and whether there's evidence of biological plausibility. And it's all of that evidence together that's allowing for us to come to one of these causality determinations. Next slide, please. And so we're organizing the literature around broad health effect categories. And so that's respiratory effects, cardiovascular effects, mortality. But within those discussions, we do have more refined integration and evaluation of evidence for specific effects within those broad categories. We're integrating the evidence across the disciplines. And I think that's really driven home by the figure that we have on the slide that's showing that it's multiple lines of evidence, as Steve noted, that's contributing to the causality determination. We're going through a process of what we like to call triangulation, where we're trying to see how all these different lines of evidence fit together to ultimately allow for us to come to some causality determination for whatever the health effect category we're evaluating. I also want to note that the integrated science assessment is only informing the hazard identification step of the risk assessment process. A lot of the quantitative analyses that are also within the risk assessment process are happening in subsequent documents in the NAAQS review. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot of the causality determinations for the health effect categories that we evaluated in the 2019 PMISA. So you have each of the health effect categories and the exposure durations and PM size fractions for which we made the causality determinations. The darkest purples are those categories where we concluded a causal or likely to be causal relationship. The asterisks are representing those categories where this is the first time that we made a causality determination, and this is because the evidence base had expanded enough for us to be able to assess the body of evidence and come to some conclusion. The triangles are representing those health effect categories that resulted in an upgrade in the causality determination from the 2009 ISA. Next slide, please. So although the causality determinations are the key scientific conclusions of the integrated science assessment, within the document, we also make other conclusions regarding topics that we know are important in subsequent steps of the NAAQS review. We call these, policy relevant considerations. And a couple of them are being touched on this slide. Because the scope of the ISA is focused on trying to identify the independent effect of criteria pollutants, we assess whether there's evidence of co-pollutant confounding. And across the studies that we evaluated, both those focusing on short and long-term PM 2.5 exposures, we found that associations remained relatively unchanged in co-pollutant models. We conducted an extensive evaluation of the components and sources evidence, as I noted on the scope slide, focusing on those studies that included both a composite measure of PM as well as individual components. And we found that across those studies that many components and sources are associated with many health effects, but the evidence does not indicate that any one source or component is more strongly related to health effects than PM 2.5 mass. In addition, we evaluated those studies that looked at alternative exposure metrics from the 24-hour average, because it's important to us help inform the averaging time of the PM max. And within the limited studies, but there's a limited number of studies that focused on sub-daily PM exposure metrics, and the evidence continues to support a 24-hour average exposure metric. And then, as I noted on a few slides prior, there are a number of studies that examine the concentration response relationship. The majority of these were studies of both short and long-term PM 2.5 exposure and mortality. And the majority continue to support a linear no threshold concentration response relationship, although there was some evidence that at lower concentrations, there are deviations from linearity, specifically for cardiovascular mortality, indicating a potential superlinear concentration response relationship. Next slide, please. So in addition to those four topics, another important consideration that we actually devote an entire chapter to is assessing the evidence as to whether there are populations or life stages that are at increased risk of a PM-related health effect. And as Administrator Regan noted, this is important because the NAAQS are intended to protect both the population as a whole, as well as those potentially at increased risk of health effects. We developed over time an approach to assess this evidence base. We're primarily focusing on epidemiologic studies that conduct stratified analyses so that we can look at whether there's evidence of differential risk. But in addition to that, we're also looking for evidence of exposure disparities. We're looking at experimental studies, conducted nanomodels of disease or controlled human exposure studies that are focusing on people with mild disease. We're also looking at dosimetric evidence and seeing how all this information fits together to inform whether or not there's evidence that a population or life stage is at increased risk of a PM-related health effect. Ultimately, this is leading to us to making a conclusory statement regarding our overall confidence as to whether the evidence supports that these populations or life stages of increased risk. And we started going about making these more conclusory statements based off of CASAC advice during the development of the 2015 ozone ISA. They wanted us to make more definitive statements regarding this evidence base. And so we developed a separate framework for us to come and make these conclusions. And I just want to make the delineation that this framework is not making causality determinations. It's just conveying our overall confidence as to whether these populations and life stages are at increased risk. And so based on our assessment of the evidence within the 2019 ISA, the strongest evidence indicating that specific populations and life stages are increased risk were for children and non-white populations. And then the evidence base varied for the other categories that we evaluated. Next slide, please. With respect to the non-ecological welfare effects that we evaluated in the 2019 ISA, consistent with the 2009 ISA, we concluded that there was a causal relationship for visibility effects, climate effects, and materials effects. Next slide, please. Now turning to the supplement, and I want to recognize the individuals that contributed to the supplement. We were on an extremely tight timeline, as I'm sure you're all aware, and without their unwavering support and dedication to developing, it would not have been possible for us to turn it around as quickly as we were able to. Next slide, please. So this is the overall organization of the supplement. The goal of the supplement was to evaluate recent studies that are most informative to the reconsideration of the 2020 PM NACs, but to do so in the context of the 2019 PM ISA. And our approach to trying to accomplish this was a couplefold. The first was to pull in the integrated synthesis chapter of the 2019 ISA to set the stage for what is the evidence base that we had at the end of the 2019 ISA. And then additionally, in our discussion of the various health effects evidence, to always introduce how we got, what was the causality determination and evidence base that supported the conclusions of the 2019 ISA, and summarize the new evidence and putting it in the context with the evidence at the end of the 2019 ISA. Next slide, please. Okay, so the process for us developing the scope of the supplement was really rooted in the fact that unlike traditional review processes for the ISA, we're not starting from scratch. We have a scientific record from the ISA, and we have the policy, some of the policy considerations that went into the completion of the 2020 PM NACs. As a result, we relied heavily on the PM policy assessment to scope out the evidence or the literature for us to consider in the development of the supplement. So on the health effects side, the focus in the policy assessment was on categories for which the ISA determined that the evidence supported either a causal relationship or a likely to be causal relationship. Additionally, when focusing on potential alternative standards, the policy assessment focused primarily on those health effect categories where that 2019 ISA concluded a causal relationship. Additionally, we felt it was important to assess additional health effects considerations, focusing on key scientific topics that evolved since the 2020 PM NACs, specifically topics that were assessed after the literature cutoff date of the 2019 ISA. On the welfare effects side, again, the rationale for developing the scope was rooted in the PM policy assessment, focusing specifically on those welfare effects categories where quantitative information was available to assess the adequacy of the secondary PM NACs. Next slide, please. And so that leads me to the actual scope of the supplement, whereas the previous slide was the rationale is how we got to the scope. So overall, the focus is on studies that became available since the literature cutoff date of the 2019 PM ISA, which is approximately January 2018 through March of 2021. Again, we're focusing on those studies that can inform the adequacy of the current PM NACs or address key scientific topics that have evolved. So for the health effect categories, as I noted on the prior slide, the focus is on those where we concluded a causal relationship, because these are the health effect categories that are most informative in assessing potential alternative standards. And so that the categories that fell within this category are studies that examine short and long-term PM 2.5 exposure and cardiovascular effects and mortality. Additionally, within the policy assessment, the focus is on US and Canadian studies with respect to assessing the different air quality characteristics of studies. And so as a result, we're focusing on US and Canadian epidemiologic studies. Additionally, focusing on epidemiologic studies that employed causal modeling methods or conducted accountability analyses, since there has been a large growth in these studies since the literature cutoff date of the 2019 ISA. Next slide, please. With respect to the key scientific topics, looking at whether there's new studies or experimental studies that were conducted at near ambient PM concentrations, as well as US and Canadian epidemiologic studies that examine the relationship between PM2.5 exposure and COVID infection and or death. A lot of these studies ended up coming out during the public comment period as we were going towards completion of the 2020 PM NACs. Additionally, there's a limited focus on at-risk populations, primarily based off of agency guidance with us assessing communities with environmental justice concerns, focusing on US and Canadian epidemiologic or exposure studies that examined either potential disparities in PM2.5 exposure or the risk of health effects by race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. For the welfare effects, because visibility impairment is the only welfare effect that has been previously quantified in the policy assessment, the focus is on US and Canadian studies that provide new information on public preferences for visibility impairment or develop methodologies that conducted quantitative analyses of light extinction. Next slide, please. Okay, now turning to the evidence that we evaluated in the supplement. This is the evidence for short-term and long-term PM2.5 exposure and cardiovascular effects. For both, recent studies support and extend the evidence base that we evaluated in the 2019 ISA. For short-term exposures, we continue to see positive associations for emergency department visits and hospital admissions, specifically for ischemic heart disease, myocardial infarction, heart failure, and arrhythmia. However, we still do see inconsistent evidence of an association for stroke outcomes, and this is regardless of the stroke subtype that's evaluated within the epidemiologic studies. We also have a number of recent epidemiologic studies that either conducted accountability analyses or employed causal modeling methods. And these studies report positive associations across different statistical approaches, which further support the associations that we see in the epidemiologic studies. With respect to long-term PM2.5 exposure, we continue to have strong evidence for cardiovascular mortality, as well as additional evidence for cardiovascular morbidity, such as coronary heart disease, stroke, and atherosclerosis progression. We did have more studies that were evaluating the concentration response relationship. And across these studies, we were across concentrations where the majority of the PM2.5 concentration data is located. We continue to see evidence of a linear no threshold concentration response relationship with some initial evidence of nonlinearity at lower concentrations, which is consistent with what we started to observe at the time of completing the 2019 ISA. There were fewer studies examining long-term PM2.5 exposure and cardiovascular effects through causal modeling methods, but these studies did reduce some of the uncertainties related to potential confounding bias and further support the associations that we see in the epidemiologic studies. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, the text looks a little bit blurry, but these are two forest plots that we have in the supplement that's combining information from recent reviews with the new literature base. So just to orient you, the black text is representing those studies that were key studies in the 2009 ISA. The red text and red dots are representing those studies that we evaluated in the 2019 ISA. And then the blue text and blue dots are representing those studies that we evaluated in the supplement. So again, just US and Canadian epidemiologic studies. On the left-hand forest plot is emergency department visits and hospital admissions for ischemic heart disease. And you can see that the new studies are consistent with those studies evaluated in the 2019 ISA as well as the 2009 ISA, reporting generally positive associations. On the right-hand side, we have studies of heart failure. And again, we see that the blue studies are in line and consistent with the evidence base that we evaluated in the 2019 as well as 2009 ISA. Next slide, please. This is a summary of evidence for long-term PM2.5 exposure and cardiovascular effects. On the left-hand side is ischemic heart disease and myocardial infarction. On the right side is cerebrovascular disease and stroke. Again, in both, the recent studies that are in blue are in line and consistent with the studies that we evaluated in the 2019 and 2009 PM ISA. So adding to the evidence base that we had at the time of the completion of the 2019 ISA. Next slide, please. So turning to studies that examine short-term PM2.5 exposure and mortality, there were only a few multi-city studies that were conducted since the completion of the 2019 ISA, but these studies are consistent with the large evidence base that we evaluated in the 2019 ISA, as well as 2009 ISA. We see positive associations at mean 24-hour average concentrations ranging from 8.8 to 12.4 microgram per meter cube. The recent studies also continue to assess the concentration response relationship, and we continue to see evidence of a linear no threshold relationship down to concentrations as low as 5. And again, we have a number of recent accountability studies as well as causal modeling studies that continue to report positive associations across different statistical approaches, which is supporting the results that we see in the multi-city studies. Next slide, please. So turning to the long-term PM2.5 exposure and mortality, this is a figure that's directly from the 2019 PM-ISA. It's a summary of North American cohort studies. And so you can see across these studies that were conducted in cohorts with different demographic characteristics, some with low and high SES participants, women only, as well as studies of occupational participants, not occupational exposures, but categories of people within the same occupation. We see consistent positive associations across studies that use different approaches to control for confounders, as well as different exposure assessment methodologies. And I separate these studies out from the new studies because there were so many new studies, I couldn't fit them all on one forest plot. So next slide, please. And so here's the relatively large number of new long-term exposure and mortality studies that have been published since the 2019 PM-ISA. Across these studies, we see positive associations at concentrations generally below 12 microgram per meter cube, with a majority less than 11.65. Again, across these studies that conducted concentration response analyses, we continue to see a generally consistent support for a linear no threshold relationship down to concentrations as low as 4, but there are some uncertainties in the shape across these studies, generally below 8 microgram per meter cube. And again, we have a number of recent studies that conducted accountability analyses or employed causal modeling methods that continue to report positive associations using different statistical approaches and support what we're seeing in the cohort studies that we evaluated to date. Next slide, please. Turning to additional health effects considerations, there was one new recent study conducted in Chapel Hill of an experimental study at near ambient concentrations. The study was in young, healthy participants, and they reported changes in lung function and cardiac function and inflammation. The respiratory effects, however, are inconsistent with what we've reported in controlled human exposure studies that were evaluated in the 2019 ISA, and there's a number of reasons that this we could be observing these differences, and that's due to the fact that this study did employ a higher ventilation rate than we had seen in other controlled human exposure studies. And there's also a longer exposure duration compared to other controlled human exposure studies. There are a number, as I'm sure you're all aware, a number of new studies that came out in the last year or so looking at PM2.5 exposure and COVID-19 infection and death. We have studies of both short and long-term PM2.5 exposure, which could be conveying different things. One as initiating the infection, whereas the other is potentially resulting in someone being more susceptible to infection. So there's different mechanistic pathways potentially for both of those different exposure durations. But across these studies, we did see some evidence of positive associations, but overall these studies are extremely complicated and subject to methodological issues. Specifically, the majority being ecological study designs, the fact that these studies were conducted during an ongoing pandemic where we're still learning about the etiology of the disease, and trying to understand how to assess for crucial factors that could influence results such as stay-at-home orders, social distancing, and mask use. Next slide, please. So since the 2019 ISA, there's actually been a large number of studies examining whether there are exposure differences or health risk disparities, both by socioeconomic status as well as race and ethnicity. For socioeconomic status, there's a variety of metrics that are used across studies to represent SES, with some of the newer approaches, including composite metrics of neighborhood SES. And these studies continue to provide additional evidence indicating that there's both disparities in PM2.5 exposure as well as health risk between populations of low SES compared to high SES groups. And we found that the strongest evidence on the health risk side was when we examined cause-specific mortality, as well as myocardial infarction and congestive heart failure. For race and ethnicity, Black populations and individuals that live in predominantly Black neighborhoods were found to experience higher PM2.5 exposures compared to non-Hispanic white populations. And that there's also additional evidence for health risk disparities for both Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black populations compared to non-Hispanic white populations for cause-specific mortality, as well as incident hypertension. Next slide, please. And so that leads me to the recent information on visibility impairment. Recent studies that use contrast instead of light extinction in preference studies reduce the variability in results across these studies. There's been reductions in both sulfate as well as an increase in wildfire contributions are changing the PM composition and the relationship between PM and visibility impairment. And it's partly as a result of this changing relationship with PM that has led to the exploration of approaches to reduce bias and the improved algorithm to estimate light extinction. Additionally, recent studies provide evidence that light extinction is due mainly to the scattering of PM 2.5, and it's generally elevated in urban areas, particularly in the Western US. Next slide, please. And so I'm just going to conclude with, I'm not going to walk through all of these, but this is the charge that we presented to all of you in thinking through or in your evaluation of the supplement. And so both this slide and the next one are just reiterating what that charge is to all of you. And so I'll just end by saying I thank you for all of your time and energy that it'll take to go through the supplement and for your service on this panel.
Thank you, Jason. That was very informative. I think given we've been at this meeting for 2 hours, that maybe we should take a short, about 10-minute break. So that would mean we would come back at 3 minutes after the hour. So, and then we will take clarifying questions from the panel when we come back from break. Well, I think our 10 minutes are up. That maybe was a little short of a break, particularly for those of us on the West Coast who's right around lunchtime. That said, I invite panelists to ask questions. And before I open it up, I see Christina Fuller's raised her hand, so I'll start with her. But I wanted to comment. We sent the charge questions out this morning, and for logistic reasons, we divided up the fourth charge question by main section, subsection of section 3. And then our vision is that we will have a combined response, but we will, in the meeting in particular and in our attention, will focus specifically on those sections. So if EPA has any comments on that, you're welcome to share that. And maybe I'm not seeing anything just yet. I will move on to Christina and then follow up with Jeremy and David.
Thank you. So first, the presentations have been very informative thus far. So thank you for the clear information. My question is, what other criteria for studies to be included in the 2019 ISA and also in the supplement?
The criteria for us of actually evaluating the studies in the ISA?
Yes, we're including those out of the,
Sure.
7,000, I think, and which ones
Sure.
were included for discussion and incorporation.
Sure. So we go through a fairly detailed process of first conducting the large literature search, and then we do some topic classification. So it gets them into discipline specific bins so that then people can then go through them. So actually the appendix of the PM ISA, it has a more detailed description of some study quality characteristics that we think about as we're going through each of the discipline specific studies. And so as we work through, we want to assess the overall quality of the study. Are they, if it's an epidemiology study, is it accounting for the appropriate confounders? How does the exposure assessment method factor into the study? Do we think that that method was adequate? So we go through a lot of criteria as we're evaluating each of these individual studies, ultimately pulling out the ones that we think are most informative and that satisfy a lot of that criteria. With respect to the supplement, we're doing the same thing, except the amount of literature that we had obviously was much narrower because we're focusing on what's most informative in the policy assessment side. But again, we're using that same type of criteria that we have in the appendix to the 2019 ISA, and that's also described in the preamble to think through as we're going through each individual study.
Okay. Thank you. I will definitely take a look at that.
Okay.
Thank you. Jeremy?
Great, thanks. First, I also want to thank the presenters for the thorough and very clear presentations. I have a specific question, probably. I have a specific question and then a more general question. I'm not sure who wants to tackle what. My specific question, probably for Jason, is could you go into a bit more detail on the rationale for circumscribing the scope of the health effects portion of the supplement to those categories that were deemed only causal according to the determination framework and not likely to be causal? I can't remember. I'm sorry. I looked quickly through the documents prior, and I'm not sure if you went into the explanation for focusing specifically on causal categories only.
Sure. So the rationale behind that was in the policy assessment side, the categories of likely causal and causal are most heavily pulled in. But then when we get to the point of working through where do we have the strongest evidence and thinking about whether or not there should be potential alternative standard levels, OQPS is then focusing on those categories where we concluded causal. So that was short-term and long-term PM 2.5 exposure and mortality and cardiovascular effects. And because of such the reliance on those categories where we concluded causal in thinking about those potential alternative standards, that was the rationale for us then scoping the supplement to only focus on those categories where we concluded causal.
Okay. But that's a bit of a deviation from the ISA itself in terms of how those kind of weighed into the final rule. Is that correct in my understanding or no? That for the health effects portion, it actually was causal and likely to be causal, whereas, or did I misunderstand that?
So in the policy assessment, they talk about the nature of effects for causal and likely to be causal. But then when they get to the point of talking about potential alternative standards, they're focusing on the air quality characteristics of the studies that were where we concluded causal.
Only causal. Okay.
Yeah.
So the more general question, maybe for Erica or Steve, can you tell us if there's precedence for what this panel is being asked to do now in terms of conducting a supplemental analysis to a final rule? And is this unusual? Has this happened previously?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I can take a first stab at that. I would invite Erica to add on anything additional. From the science assessment side with, the supplement that we've developed here, it's not unusual for us to do some kind of an update after we release the final ISA and before the rulemaking or during the rulemaking phase, just to make sure there are no, kind of game-changing studies out there that might, change our direction. This is a first time for us in the ISA program to actually put that document together and put it in front of CASAC. So this is the first time we're doing that. There are examples, if you go back to the air quality criteria document days where we did something similar to this. I think in those examples, there was probably more time that elapsed. And so, between the original criteria document and the supplemented criteria document. In this case, we've got about 3 years of literature, so it's not trivial, but it's close in proximity to that document. So it is a first for this program, and I think what we're kind of going through this with you for the first time, and that is going to be the challenge. I think is we want your comment and critique on the supplement, but we tried to bring forward, as Jason mentioned, the main conclusions from the ISA so that you can also kind of comment on those and in the context of the new information and make sure that as a body, the two documents are addressing the questions that Erica's office needs to address. I don't know, Erica, did you have anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, Steve, I think that there are of older examples where we did some supplementary documents that were sent to CASAC. In the early 90s for ozone, there was a supplement prepared and reviewed by CASAC, and I think also for PM and SO2, maybe there was one. So there are other instances where we found this necessary to do, and I think anytime we see a substantial gap in the science that could, the real question is this science potentially important for the decision? What are the pivotal pieces of evidence for informing the decision? And it's not that we don't care about the rest of the literature or other studies. It's that at the end of the day, all of that literature will get folded into the next review. So what we want to focus on here is anything that will be a game changer for this decision. And that's why we kind of narrow it down to those studies that are most relevant to the decisions at hand on level and things like that. And certainly, I think Steve already said this, but certainly if there are things that we have missed, we invite the CASAC and commenters to provide those studies. That is always a goal for us to, as part of this public process, to gather those additional pieces of information. That's why these documents are draft, because we realize that we may have missed things that we should have included.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. David.
So thank you again, very thorough presentations, and Jason specifically very well detailed. I just had a quick question. I was looking at the PM components and sources that you had put up on slide 9, and looking and saying that the evidence does or does not indicate that any one source or component is more strongly related with health effects than PM 2.5. So my question was, what was what was the decision tool or tools that were used to make that determination? And if so, does that limit, what studies specifically were included in it? Because there's
Sure.
lots of different ways that kind of an assessment could be made.
Yes, I agree. And as I'm sure, as you're aware, there's a challenge in interpreting the components literature itself because of the variety of methods that have been used across studies and just the different limitations and advantages of each of those. So what we did was we focused on those component studies that also had PM 2.5 mass effect associations reported as well. And if you look in, we have sections within the 2019 ISA that are specific to components and sources. And we are trying to figure out the best way to convey this because we know that a qualitative discussion is going to be really hard to see across all of these studies what direction is the evidence pointing. And so we thought really hard about what's a graphical way that we can present this information. And so there's a couple approaches that we took within the ISA. One is we developed these bar charts to look at the direction of associations for all of the individual components, depending on the health fit category we are evaluating, as well as the pattern of association for PM 2.5 mass within those studies. And that way we could look across all of those. We also developed some heat map type of figures that allowed for us to show that there's a variety of lags in which effects are observed, different directions of associations depending on the component. And across all of those, when we put it together, the evidence for PM 2.5 mass is remarkably consistent across all of these studies, but there's a large degree of variability in the components and sources associations that we observe across studies. And so when we put that all together, it showed us that, yes, a lot of these components are associated with health effects. A lot of these sources are associated with health effects, but PM 2.5 mass was most consistently associated with health effects compared to all of those.
Okay, thanks. I'm sure when I'll dig through some of that more, I may come back to your questions another time, but thank you.
All right, sure.
Thank you. So Corey Ziegler.
Hi, I'll echo everybody else's thanks for the three really helpful presentations here. I have a question that I think is probably best directed to Jason, which is, you mentioned, it's a question about causal modeling strategy. So to be clear, I'm not talking about the causal determinations that like Jeremy was just asking about, for example, but you mentioned a few times accountability studies and studies that use causal modeling approaches, EPI studies that played a role in the supplement specifically because they were sort of new. Does EPA use a particular definition of causal modeling study, or is this like a case-by-case analysis of in EPA judgment? Did this study use a certain type of methodology or some certain common methodologies, or is there a more specific sort of operating definition of what that means?
That's a really great question. We don't have a specific definition. I think we probably should come up with one. I mean, we have some quotes that we pulled up at some of the initial studies that folks were involved with, focusing where they called them causal inference studies, and we provide that definition within the supplement and the ISA. But you raise a really good point of probably moving forward is probably advantageous to us to have a working definition of what we are considering a causal modeling study. I mean, we know depending on the methodology used, you could call a whole bunch of them that. So maybe we need to work forward and think about that. And that would be a good addition to the supplement and other assessments that we have going forward.
Great, thanks very much.
Sure.
That's all the hands that are raised. Is there anybody else Barbara Turpin.
Could let everyone else talk first, I guess. Let's see, I just wanted to make sure that I heard you right about the adverse effects of visibility. Did you mostly look at preference information for that?
So in the 2019 ISA, there is a lot of preference information, but also analyses that were quantitative in nature. And so it's a variety. In the supplement, there was only one new study that included some preference information. Yeah.
And have you thought about looking at effects of visibility on property values? Does it make any sense to you? But where Leanne lives, if you can't see Mount Rainier, your housing value goes down.
Yeah, we've not traditionally included studies that are focusing on costs, such as that. But yeah, so those have traditionally been outside the scope of the assessment.
Makes sense. One more thing about, you know, I thought I'd say the word wildfire. And I know about exceptional events, but I wondered if you wanted to say anything more about wildfires. Maybe you
Not
don't.
anything specifically.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just say that, you know, the agency has a lot of wildfire research going on, and this kind of falls into the almost similar to the components question where, you know, there's a lot going on in wildfire emissions. More, you know, EM is a big part of that, but there's a lot else going on there. And our inclusion of you know, components, we're really trying to tie that, as Jason mentioned, to studies that are specific looking at PM and the component. So to the extent that, you know, we have that information, it's included in the ISA.
So Aaron put a note in the chat that we need to make sure that all our interactions are public. So it looks like there was a little bit more discussion about causal, but I think most people that chimed in just wanted to make sure that the question that Corey asked was one that they had too, and letting people know that. Is there any additional comments or questions for EPA? This is our time to ask clarifying questions. Of course, once we've all dug into the document in more detail, I'm sure we'll have more, and EPA will be at all our next meetings, and so we can make ample use of their expertise in our future meetings as well as today. I'm personally finding this extremely helpful to have this introduction before we dig into the documents. I'll reserve judgment in the end for how it seems after we've done the review, but having your perspective and advice in advance of our in-depth work is, I think, very helpful. So I appreciate this new structure. So Neetha.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those presentations. They were quite detailed. My question's in reference to the forest plots showing the summative evidence over the new evidence in comparison to the past. Has there been any concentrated efforts to look at the same effects in the susceptible populations? You mentioned in one of the slides that both communities of color and children seem to have disproportionate impact, and trying to understand what levels are seen in those studies in particular may be helpful when reviewing this new recommendation.
That's a really good question. We've not focused specifically on the concentrations at which effects are observed in those studies. We've broadly focused on whether or not there's evidence that those populations or life stages are at increased risk broadly, not tied to specific concentrations.
Thank you. Michael, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to reiterate the point about wildfires, and you know, it's certainly a major problem in the West and a number of other areas, but wildfires, and this is a lot out of EPA's research base, produce much more toxic particles, especially when they intersect with burning homes and other built structures. And this is probably more for future reference, but I think it's really important for considering that communities that are impacted by wildfires may actually have other health effects parameters that need to be looked at, especially short-term effects like asthma and cardiovascular disease may be more disproportionately affected in areas that are subject to wildfire.
It sounds like that wasn't as much of a clarifying question about what we heard. It sounds like useful. I encourage Michael to bring it back when we're actually deliberating, because I think we're supposed to be mostly focused on understanding what EPA's done today and clarifying what they've done, as opposed to starting our deliberations.
Sorry.
That's fine. That's fine. It's very tempting with all the evidence we've been faced with to bring those things up. Other questions? Clarifying questions for EPA?
Leanne, I'll just mention that Jason and myself will be around the rest of the afternoon. If there's additional questions that come up for ORD after we've heard from our OER colleagues in their presentation.
Okay, Christina has another question.
Yes, what Dr. Kleiman was just saying just brought up another question for me in terms of what studies are included. So the EPI studies that were included, did they only look at particulate matter exposure as the primary exposure, or were studies included that looked at interactions with some of the other vulnerability factors that have been discussed, like race and class?
So the overall evaluation of the health effects evidence is focusing on just ambient PM exposures, but obviously there's studies that are focusing on specific populations and life stages. So they're discussed in the ISA itself. And then the separate characterization of evidence looking at at-risk populations is also looking at potential interactions between PM exposure and then different factors that could result in a population or being at increased risk of a health effect.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Great, thanks. Any additional questions for ORD? I'm thinking maybe we'll move on to the presentation on the policy assessment, and then of course we can continue to ask questions at the end. So we've already been introduced to Erica Sasser. We also have presenting Ms. Karen Wesson, Lars Perlmutt, and Nicole Hagan. So I invite you to tell us about the policy assessment.
Thank you, Dr. Shepard. My name is Karen Wesson. I am the group leader of the Ambient Standards Group at EPA. And my group oversees the development of the policy assessment and also the rulemaking stage of the NAAQS reviews. So I am here this afternoon to talk to you about the draft PM policy assessment. And I have the pleasure of sharing this presentation with several of my colleagues. And so I will be handing off some slides to them. Dr. Lars Perlmutt and Dr. Nicole Hagan will both be reviewing some of the slides. And they are the co-leads for this PM NAAQS reconsideration. In addition, Dr. Elizabeth Chan will also be delivering some slides here. And she is the staff lead of the risk assessment work included in the policy assessment. So in covering the draft policy assessment, first I'm just going to touch on a little bit of the background on policy assessments in general. And then we're going to move through some slides that discuss the draft PM policy assessment approach and the preliminary conclusions included in this document for the primary PM 25 standards, the primary 10 standard, and the secondary PM standards. And then we'll close with the charge to CASAC. And so moving to the next slide. So I just want to quickly go over what a policy assessment is. So a policy assessment is meant to bridge the gap between the agency's scientific assessments and the judgments required of the administrator in determining whether it's appropriate to retain or revise the NAAQS. So on the right here, we have a diagram that leads us through the steps that we take in the policy assessment. And as Erica mentioned, the main goal is to look at adequacy of the existing standards. In doing that, we look at the scientific evidence assessed in the ISA. We also look at the risk assessment information. And in looking at that information, we ask the question, does this information call into question the adequacy of the current PM standards? If the answer is no, then the draft PM policy assessment conclusions note that it would be appropriate to consider retaining the current standards. If the answer is yes, then the draft policy assessment goes on to further evaluate the scientific evidence and the risk assessment information and looking to inform and identify potential alternative standards. And in doing so, we look at the standards in the case of the elements that make up the standards. And those are the indicator, the averaging time, the form, and the level. And then we use these elements in looking at a potential range of options. So the final policy assessment, it seeks to provide as broad of a range of policy options as are supportable by the science. And it recognizes that the final decision will reflect the administrator's judgments as to what weight is to be placed on various types of information. And then also, in addition, the draft policy assessment is intended to facilitate the CASAC advice regarding the adequacy of the standards to the administrator. So next slide. So this slide is just a nice table of the standards with respect to the PM NAAQS. You can see we have the indicators of PM 2.5 as well as PM 10. We have both primary standards, which focus on health endpoints, as well as secondary standards, which focus on the welfare endpoints. For the primary standard, we have an annual standard as well as a 24-hour standard. The annual standard with respect to form is an annual average. And in that way, that standard focuses on typical exposures averaged over a year. Then we also have the 24-hour standard with respect to the primary. And that standard has the form of the 98th percentile. And with that form, that standard is focused on looking at non-typical exposures or exposures that are occurring up in the upper percentiles. With respect to the secondary, we have corresponding standards as well, though I'll note that for the annual standard, the secondary standard is at a level of 15. And then for PM10, we have a 24-hour averaging time for both the primary and secondary standards, and at a level of 150, not to be exceeded more than once a year. So as was discussed with respect to the standards, the annual standard was revised last in the 2012 review, and it was revised with respect to level, going from a level of 15 to 12. In addition, during that review, EPA eliminated spatial averaging and also put a near roadway network into place. And so moving to slide 4. So, and focusing on the goal of addressing adequacy of the standard, the draft policy assessment focuses on PM 2.5 related health outcomes that have been found in the ISA to be causal or to be likely causal. So additionally, our framework focuses on the importance of looking at the combined protection provided by the standards together. And so with respect to the primary PM 2.5 standards, we have an annual standard as well as a 24-hour standard. The annual standard with its annual average form is principally looked at as providing protection against health, health exposures of typical daily or typical averaged over a year PM 2.5 exposures. In contrast to that, the 24-hour standard with the 98th percentile form is generally viewed as a means of providing protection against short-term or peak exposures and as providing protection against those types of concentrations. And then lastly, we recognize that in looking at the standard, that there's a relationship between compliance with the standard and the exposures in an area that are associated with that standard. And as such, you will see in the draft policy assessment discussion of a term, design values. And so design value, the design value term is a term which is, it's basically the standard as measured at a compliance or regulatory monitor. And in an area that has multiple monitors, we have something we call the area design value. And that area design value is generally the highest monitor in that area. And because it's the highest, it's looked to judge whether the area is meeting or not meeting the standard. And in noting this association, I think it's important also to note that in general, when one looks at the air quality distributions in an area, that the concentrations across the area tend to be at or mostly below that of the highest monitor. So there's a distribution of concentrations across the area. And that's really important to think about with respect to the standard itself and what a specific standard when implemented at a compliance monitor will do to the distribution of exposures across an area. And so you will see that concept discussed in the draft policy assessment. So moving to the next slide, slide 5. We will talk in more detail in the following slides, the puzzle pieces that we see coming together in making these conclusions. But the draft policy assessment concludes that the current available evidence and information can reasonably be viewed as calling into question the adequacy of the primary annual PM2.5 standard. In particular, the draft policy assessment concludes that the evidence supports revising the level of the annual standard while retaining the indicator averaging time and form. With respect to the 24-hour standard, the draft policy assessment concludes that the evidence does not support the need for additional protection against short-term exposures to peak PM2.5 concentrations past those already provided by the current suite of standards and supports consideration of retaining the current 24-hour standard at the level of 35. And in the next set of slides, I'll step through some more information of how those conclusions are seen with respect to the scientific evidence and the quantitative risk assessment. So moving to slide 6, with respect to the primary PM2.5 scientific evidence, the 2019 ISA and the draft ISA supplement both reaffirm and strengthen the evidence from the 2009 ISA, which was the ISA used in the 2012 review decision. It both found that there was a causal relationship between long and short-term PM2.5 exposures and mortality and cardiovascular effects, as well as likely to be causal relationship between long and short-term PM2.5 exposures and respiratory effects, as well as long-term PM2.5 exposures and cancer and nervous system effects. In addition, the ISA indicated populations that the evidence supported as being most at risk for experiencing PM2.5 related health events. And those populations included older adults, people with pre-existing cardiovascular or respiratory disease, children, and racial minorities. In addition, in the draft ISA supplement, it provides additional support for information showing that PM2.5 related exposures and risk disparities exist for different racial and ethnical groups. So next slide. So with respect to the experimental evidence as viewed in the draft policy assessment, the draft policy assessment concluded that the experimental evidence, including the animal tox studies and the controlled human exposure studies, both strengthen support for the biological plausibility through which PM2.5 exposures can lead to serious effects, such as those observed in the epidemiological studies. More specifically, with respect to the animal tox studies, the draft policy assessment found that those studies provided further evidence to support the biological mechanisms and the plausibility of various adverse effects. However, it concluded that body of evidence does not necessarily specifically inform the level of the standard, of the adequacy of the level of the standard. In contrast to that, the draft policy assessment concludes that the controlled human exposure studies can be used to provide some insight into short-term concentration levels that could elicit adverse effects. More specifically, it concluded that the controlled human exposure studies provide evidence for health effects following single short-term exposures around 2 hours to PM2.5 concentrations that correspond to peak concentrations of 120 micrograms per meter cubed or higher. So in the draft policy assessment, there's also an air quality analysis that's included. That analysis looks at whether these concentrations observed in the controlled human exposure studies occur in areas that are meeting the current primary standards. And it finds that with respect to 2-hour ambient concentrations of PM2.5 at monitoring sites meeting the current standards, that those concentrations almost never exceed 30 micrograms per meter cubed. And thus, the draft policy assessment concludes that this information suggests that the suite of the primary PM2.5 standards provides protection against the types of exposures observed in these controlled human exposure studies. So moving to slide 7. I'm sorry, moving to slide 8. With respect to the epidemiological evidence, the draft policy assessment concludes that the epidemiological studies that assess associations between PM2.5 exposures and health outcomes that are most strongly supported by the body of scientific evidence can help inform adequacy of the existing PM2.5 standards. Similar to the decision frameworks in the previous reviews, the draft policy assessment notes that with respect to epidemiological studies, that there is no specific point in the air quality distribution in those studies that represents a bright line. So a line at or above which effects have been observed and below which effects have not been observed. So given that, the draft policy assessment further notes that there is a significantly greater confidence in the magnitude and significance of the observed associations for the part of the air quality distribution corresponding to the bulk of the health evidence in each of those studies. So around where most of the data resides. And this generally is at or around the mean in these epidemiological studies. And corresponding to that, the draft policy assessment also notes that while the greatest confidence is at the mean, the tails of the distributions are those represented by the lower PM2.5 concentrations don't provide as strong of a support or have more limited support provided for health effects association at those lower concentrations. So noting within this framework of means being important with respect to finding that the greatest confidence can be seen in the associations at this value, the study reported means of the epidemiological studies play a significant role in the draft policy assessment. And you will see that as you look specifically at chapter 3. And diving a little bit deeper, when one thinks about these means, the draft policy assessment recognizes that the overall mean PM2.5 concentrations, when reported in these studies, for example, in the short-term exposure studies, they reflect an average. And they reflect an average across the study population, and they also reflect an average across the years of the study. And as such, that the means from these short-term studies more effectively reflect a long-term average of 24-hour PM2.5 exposures. So given this, in examining the evidence in the draft policy assessment, we evaluate the overall study reported means in the EPI studies from both short-term as well as long-term studies. We evaluate those means as being comparable to the current annual PM2.5 standard level. Contrary to that, the draft policy assessment also notes that in looking at these study means and looking at the epidemiological information, it provides more limited support for assessing the adequacy of the level of the 24-hour standard, given its focus on the upper percentiles of exposure. And so with that, I will turn over the presentation to Lars Perlmutt to step through consideration of the EPI evidence in a little bit more detail.
Thank you so much, Karen. So the aim of the next several slides is to provide a summary of how we consider the epidemiologic evidence in considering the PM2.5 standard, including the new and expanded approaches that estimate PM2.5 concentrations in these epidemiologic studies. So in the 2012 review, all of the key studies use monitors to estimate exposure. But in this current reconsideration, epidemiologic studies that use hybrid modeling approaches have greatly expanded. These hybrid model-based studies use a variety of fusion techniques, which combine ground-based monitoring data with air quality modeled estimates and/or information from satellites. The hybrid modeling studies also provide a much greater spatial coverage of PM2.5 estimates, including in areas where monitors do not exist. So the draft policy assessment recognizes that the mean PM2.5 concentrations, which are reported in studies that use monitors as well as hybrid-based studies, may not be as straightforward as previous reviews, again, where all of the epidemiologic studies were based on monitors. As such, the draft policy assessment includes information and analyses on what a study reported mean PM2.5 concentration represents and how this information can inform the consideration of the PM2.5 annual standard level. In previous reviews, like the 2012 review, analyses evaluated how the current annual design value relates to mean concentrations that are reported in epidemiologic studies. But again, in key studies in previous reviews, this was only completed for monitor-based studies and not hybrid model approaches. So the comparability of mean concentrations can be affected by whether the study is a hybrid-based modeling study or a monitor-based study. It can also be affected by the spatial scale of the study, such as whether the study is primarily in an urban area or if the study includes urban and rural areas. In addition, comparability can be affected by studies that apply some aspects of population weighting, such as taking the average concentration of all grid cells and averaging them up to the zip code level. This reconsideration therefore recognizes, previous slide, just real, not quite yet, thank you. So this reconsideration therefore recognizes that the relationship between mean PM2.5 concentrations in epidemiologic studies and design values is more complicated during this reconsideration because we have more epidemiologic studies that use hybrid modeling approaches and not just monitored studies. Next slide, please. So noting that our approach in the current review is consistent with previous reviews and using overall study reported means to inform the level of the annual PM 2.5 standard, I would like to walk you through just a simple example of how the mean between monitored-based studies and hybrid modeling approaches compare between one another, as well as how they compare to an area annual design value. Now, as Karen noted earlier, design values are calculated using monitored concentrations, and the area design value is defined as the max value at the highest monitor in an area and is used for compliance of the standard. Now, to walk you through the simplified example and exhibited on the right, what this figure shows are hybrid model estimates in the state of Georgia, as well as the Atlanta CBSA, and monitored concentrations within the Atlanta CBSA. The color gradient shown on the right is based on hybrid modeling estimates and exhibit average PM 2.5 estimates using data from 2014 to 2016, where the blue areas are lower PM 2.5 concentrations and in general are seen away from the CBSA and more rural areas, while the red areas are higher PM 2.5 concentrations. On the left side of the panel, we have circles that exhibit monitors within the CBSA and exhibit those PM 2.5 monitored concentrations. So using data from hybrid model estimates, as well as the monitored concentrations, we can make several observations. With respect to monitors, the average monitor design value across the CBSA of Atlanta is 9.3, while the highest monitor value, which is the area design value, is 10.4. Now, when we look at the hybrid modeling estimates, which are the last four values in the table, in estimates that do not apply population weighting, concentrations are lower in Georgia, which of course incorporates more rural areas compared to Atlanta. Next, when comparing estimates within Atlanta and within Georgia respectively, we see higher mean concentrations in estimates that apply population weighting. So these multiple aspects of comparing monitored studies and hybrid model estimates suggest that lower means are reported when concentrations are estimated using both urban and rural areas and do not apply population weighting, while higher means are reported when an approach focuses on an urban area alone or applies population weighting. Now, noting that these aspects are just using a simplified example, the draft policy assessment also completed a national analysis using two hybrid modeling approaches and corroborating the results seen in this simplified example. So in general, these national scale air quality analyses indicate that study reported means are generally lower than annual design values. Further, the monitored-based study reported means are somewhat lower than the area annual design values. And these estimates are similar to those that we found in the 2012 review. The nationwide analyses exhibited in the draft PA also exhibit that hybrid modeling based studies are lower than monitored based studies. And finally, these analyses exhibit that when hybrid modeling applies population weighting, the relationship between design values and means are comparable to monitored based means. Next slide, please. So in the context of understanding the issues associated with the comparability of means in the studies that use monitors versus those studies that use hybrid modeling approaches, the draft policy assessment notes the following observations. Air quality analyses that assess a relationship between design values and mean reported concentrations find that in monitored studies, design values are often 10 to 20% higher than annual average monitored concentrations, which again is comparable to hybrid modeling studies that apply population weighting, where design values here are 15 to 18% greater than average annual PM 2.5 concentrations. In hybrid modeling approaches that don't apply population weighting, design values are generally 40 to 50% higher than annual average PM 2.5 concentrations. So these air quality analyses highlight how study means can vary depending on monitored versus hybrid modeling approaches in which are applied, and within hybrid modeling approaches, whether or not the study applies population weighting aspects. Moving forward, relative to overall mean PM 2.5 concentrations reported in key US epidemiologic studies, we see ranges from 9.9 to 16.5 in monitored-based studies, 9.3 to 12.2 in studies that use hybrid modeling approaches and apply population weighting, and 8.1 to 11.9 for studies that use hybrid modeling approaches and do not apply population weighting. Also, as Karen previously mentioned, past decision frameworks have also placed some weight on considering the annual standard level relative to the 25th and 10th percentile of data, while also noting that epidemiologic studies provide more limited support at these percentiles for the health effects associations on which these distributions are based on. Within these studies, data is much more limited as opposed to mean concentrations in studies. So in the context of monitored-based studies, the 25th percentile is at or above 11.5 micrograms per meter cubed, while the 10th percentile is at or above 9.8. Next, moving to the hybrid modeling studies that apply population weighting, 25th percentile ranges range from 6.7 to 9.1, while the 10th percentile in two studies that provided data are 4.7 and 7.3. In those hybrid modeling approaches that do not apply population weighting, their 25th percentiles range from 4.6 to 9.2. Now, with regard to the Canadian studies, monitored-based studies have mean concentrations that generally range from 7 to 9 micrograms per meter cubed, while all of the hybrid modeling studies in Canadian studies apply population weighting and have mean concentrations that range from between 6 and 10. I do note that the policy assessment was unable to complete analyses of air quality that help us understand how Canadian means relate to a US design value. So we do lack information that could help us interpret these values in the context of a US annual standard. Next slide, please. So the information presented in the previous slides and related to key epidemiologic studies is also supported and supplemented with additional forms of epidemiologic evidence. With respect to causal modeling studies, these studies use a variety of statistical methods and support associations seen in key epidemiologic studies. In addition, they reduce uncertainties with respect to confounding bias and also inform the causal nature of the relationship between short-term and long-term PM 2.5 exposure and mortality and cardiovascular effects. Next, we have several studies that we term restricted analyses. Restricted analyses are analyses that restrict daily air quality below a threshold like 35 or annual average PM concentrations below 12, for example. These studies also support positive and significant associations that are often greater in magnitude than their main analyses cohorts. And they also have mean concentrations that are lower than the mean concentration reported in the main analysis, which has a range between about 8 and 11.5. We view these restricted analyses to further support epidemiologic associations at lower concentrations. A third type of epidemiologic piece of evidence that we're looking at are accountability studies. Accountability studies are those studies that evaluate the potential for public health improvements as PM 2.5 concentrations decline over time. These studies support that as PM declines, public health improvements occur, including in some studies that have a starting PM 2.5 concentration that's below the level of the current primary standard. Now, at this point, I'd like to pass things to Elizabeth Chan, who will discuss the results of the risk assessment.
Thank you, Lars. So in addition to considering the scientific evidence of health effects attributable to PM 2.5 exposures, EPA also assesses and considers potential health risks that could be allowed under current and potential alternative standards. So this risk assessment combines systematically identified input data, such as epidemiologically derived concentration response relationships, baseline health incidence data, and population information, with air quality modeling adjusted to just meet both the current and certain potential alternative standards. Specifically, we evaluate 4 alternative annual standards with levels of 11, 10, 9, and 8 micrograms per cubic meter, and 1 alternative 24-hour standard with a level of 30 micrograms per cubic meter. Regarding study area selection, we included CDSAs with relatively dense ambient monitoring networks and large populations that were either above or approximately 20% below the current PM standards, which roughly equates to an annual design value of 10 micrograms per cubic meter or a 24-hour design value of 30 micrograms per cubic meter. And we ended up selecting the 47 CDSA urban study areas shown here on the map, which include nearly 1/3 of the total adult US population, and is colored to represent whether each area exceeded the annual, 24-hour, or both design value cutoffs. And the last point I want to make on this slide is that in addition to updating the overall risk estimate in this reconsideration that was included in the 2020 policy assessment, we've also added a new analysis assessing risk within specific at-risk demographic populations identified in the ISA, which was added due to the strong evidence for racial and ethnic disparities in PM 2.5 exposures and PM 2.5 related health risk. Next slide, please. So this slide goes into a bit more detail on some of the input data used in the risk assessment, starting with the concentration response relationships. Specific concentration response functions used were identified using established criteria that take into account factors such as study design, geographic coverage, study size, and PM concentrations, and all evaluate large multi-city cohorts looking at the health outcome total mortality. Regarding the air quality surfaces, we used an approach that involved adjusting CMAQ modeled PM 2.5 air quality for the year 2015 2 different ways, either preferentially adjusting direct PM emissions or preferentially adjusting precursor emissions to simulate changes in secondarily formed PM 2.5. We also used linear interpolation and extrapolation to simulate just meeting the additional alternative annual standard levels of 8, 9, and 11 micrograms per cubic meter. And as discussed in the lower portion of this slide, the at-risk analysis included some of the same inputs as the overall risk assessment, such as the study areas, as well as some unique inputs, such as the specific concentration response functions. However, the study identified as best characterizing risk for the at-risk analysis was also used in the overall risk assessment, which evaluated Medicare beneficiaries and thus only included those aged 65 and older. Next slide, please. So overall conclusions of the risk assessment are that the current primary PM 2.5 standards could allow a substantial number of PM 2.5 attributable deaths in the US. For example, we estimate upwards of 45,000 PM 2.5 attributable deaths due to long-term exposures in a single year in the 47 urban study areas when air quality is adjusted to simulate just meeting the current PM 2.5 standards. In the study areas where we evaluated the 4 potential alternative annual standards, we expect reductions in PM 2.5 associated mortality will increase if the alternative annual standard is reduced. So for example, moving from the current annual standard of 12 down to 11 micrograms per cubic meter may reduce PM attributable mortality by 7 to 9%, whereas moving from the current annual standard down to a lower annual standard of 8 micrograms per cubic meter may reduce PM attributable mortality by 30 to 37%. In contrast, revising the level of the 24-hour standard is estimated to lower PM 2.5 associated risks across a more limited population and number of areas than revising the annual standard. So shifting to the conclusions of the at-risk analysis, overall, we found that Black populations may experience disproportionately higher exposures and risk rates under the various simulated annual air quality conditions as compared to white populations. And we've got some example results evaluating the current and the modeled suite of standards to walk through on the next slide. The next slide, please. Thanks. So in these figures, each colored dot shows the average of a demographic population for white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, and Native American populations. Although we focus on comparisons between Black and white populations, as the ISA identified Black populations as being particularly at risk. We chose to show exposures and risk next to each other to be able to gain insight into whether the effects of differences in exposure versus the effects of demographic specific concentration response function relationships. So starting with the top half of this slide, we're showing the average PM 2.5 concentrations on the left and the average mortality risk rate for 100,000 people on the right, under simulated air quality scenarios just meeting the current suite of standards in the top row and just meeting the modeled alternative standards of 10 annually and 30 daily in the second row. In both scenarios, the Black population on average experiences the highest PM concentrations and mortality risk rates across all demographic groups analyzed. Additionally, all populations experience a decrease in exposure and risk under the simulated alternative suite of standards here. While the average PM 2.5 concentrations on the left are a fairly straightforward metric, for example, showing that the average white population experiences a PM 2.5 concentration of around 11 micrograms per cubic meter under a simulated air quality scenario just meeting the current annual standards, the mortality risk rate metric on the right is a bit more complex and shows the number of deaths attributable to long-term PM2 exposure per 100 individuals of each demographic. And in the lower slide, the lower portion of this slide, we're showing the difference between the two scenarios in the top figure, with the average PM 2.5 concentration reduction on the left side and the average mortality risk rate reduction per 100,000 individuals on the right, when moving from the current suite of standards to the alternative suite of modeled standards, 10 annual and 30 daily. The left side of the lower figure shows that while all demographic populations experience at least a 1.5 microgram per cubic meter decrease in PM 2.5 concentrations, on average, the Black population experiences the greatest decrease of all demographics analyzed. Similarly, on the right side of the lower figure, the mortality risk rate is predicted to be reduced in all demographic populations under the potential lower alternative suite of standards, with the greatest reduction predicted in the Black population when moving from the current to the alternative suite of PM standards. And with that, I'll hand it back to Lars.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So let's bring it all together now. So we've laid out the approach we've used, the analyses that can inform this approach, the evidence related to experimental and epidemiologic evidence. So in this slide, I'd like to begin discussing the draft policy assessment preliminary conclusions on the PM 2.5 standards. The draft policy assessment preliminarily concludes that the adequacy of the primary PM 2.5 standards can be called into question based on numerous pieces of evidence. With respect to the epidemiologic evidence, there's a long-standing body of health evidence, including evidence strengthened in this review in the 2019 ISA and the draft ISA supplement, that supports the relationship between short and long-term exposure to PM 2.5 and multiple health outcomes, including mortality and serious morbidity effects. Recent US and Canadian epidemiologic studies that report positive and statistically significant health effect associations for PM 2.5 air quality likely to be allowed by the current standards are also a piece of evidence. With respect to the accountability studies, these studies indicate that improvements in public health occur with improvements in air quality, where starting PM 2.5 concentrations are at or below the current annual standard. In our restricted analyses, these studies also show positive and significant associations when only using data below the level of the current standards, and these associations are often greater in magnitude compared to the main analyses. And finally, with respect to the risk assessment notes that current standards could allow thousands of PM 2.5 associated deaths per year, and most would occur between concentrations of 10 and 12. Next slide, please. So moving forward, the draft policy assessment outlines preliminary conclusions on the level, which I'll outline in these next few slides. In this slide, a level below 12 and as low as 10 could be supported by numerous pieces of evidence and the extent that weight is put on these pieces of evidence. First, setting a standard that's expected to maintain air quality distributions below those in most key US EPI studies recognizes the general relationship between study means and area design values in conjunction with the means of the key US epidemiologic studies. So with respect to the monitored based studies, mean concentrations range from 9.9 to 16.5, and our air quality analyses suggest that the associated area annual design values are 10 to 20% greater than the monitored PM 2.5 concentrations. In hybrid model studies that apply aspects of population weighting in key EPI studies, the means range from 9.3 to 12.2, and our air quality analyses suggest that the associated area annual design values are generally 15 to 18% greater than mean PM 2.5 concentrations that apply population weighting. In our hybrid modeling studies that do not apply aspects of population weighting, the means range from 8.1 to 11.9, while air quality analyses again suggest that the associated area annual design values are generally 40 to 50% greater than study reported means that do not apply population weighting. So as such, choosing a level lower than 12 and as low as 10 could take into account individual study characteristics like the study design and how a mean is reported, the study size and study location, as well as any uncertainties in the study itself or within our analyses of study air quality and that relationship to a design value. Next slide, please. To further support a level below 12 and as low as 10, weight could also be placed on additional aspects of the scientific evidence, including using the quantitative estimates in the risk assessment and setting a standard that reduces PM 2.5 associated risks, where a large portion of risk reduction would occur within the range of reported means of key epidemiologic studies. Weight could also be placed on accountability studies and setting a level within the range of starting mean PM 2.5 concentrations that report public health improvements with declines in PM 2.5, and some of which have these starting mean concentrations within the range of 10 to 12. Lastly, a level lower than 12 and as low as 10 could be supported to the extent that weight is placed on uncertainties within the scientific evidence and risk assessment, and that might call into question the potential for additional public health improvements beyond those achieved by a level as low as 10. Next slide, please. On the other hand, a range of levels below 10 and as low as 8 could be supported if less weight is placed on limitations in the evidence, leading to more uncertainty at lower concentrations. To support a level below 10 and as low as 8, greater weight could be placed on maintaining the PM2.5 air quality distribution further below mean concentrations present in most key EPI studies. Doing such would place weight on setting the annual standard below most or all means in key epidemiologic studies, and for a standard as low as 8, this would include setting the standard below the means of those hybrid modeling studies that do not apply population weighting. Maintaining air quality distributions further below the means identified in most key epidemiologic studies would also rely on placing less weight on analyses that evaluate the relationship between design values and study reported mean concentrations. A level of below 10 and as low as 8 would also place greater weight on key Canadian studies that again report mean concentrations in monitored studies generally in the range between 7 and 9, and in modeled studies that apply population, which all apply population weighting, and which range between 6 and 10 micrograms per meter cubed. In order to support a level below 10 and as low as 8, weight could also be placed on setting a standard level around the lower percentiles of PM2.5 reported in key studies, like the 25th percentile. Next slide, please. Additional evidence to revise the level from below 10 to as low as 8 could also be supported through the following pieces of evidence. Using the accountability studies, the importance of additional PM2.5 associated health risks below 10 and continued reduction in public health risk below 8, which is the lowest level examined in the risk assessment. Weight could also be placed on the restricted analyses. Again, these are analyses that restrict air quality below the level of the current annual standard. These studies report positive and significant associations, which further support the strength of associations at lower PM2.5 concentrations. Finally, a level below 10 and as low as 8 could be supported by estimates from the at-risk analyses in the risk assessment. These estimates indicate that a revised annual standard at a lower level show that the largest estimated impacts on reducing exposure and risk occurs in Black populations. A level below 10 and as low as 8 could be supported to the extent that weight is placed on these evidence and the importance of the potential public health improvements of those reductions. Next slide, please. So I've just walked you through the information related to the scientific evidence on how revising an annual standard could be supported. In this slide, I'll just briefly discuss the preliminary conclusions on the level of the 24-hour standard. So with respect to the 24-hour standard, the evidence does not call into question the adequacy of the current 24-hour standard and supports retaining the level of the standard with a level of 35 micrograms per meter cubed. With respect to the evidence, more specifically, the controlled human exposure studies and animal toxicologic studies do support the need for a standard that provides protection against short-term exposure to PM2.5. More specifically, controlled human exposure studies provide consistent evidence for potential adverse effects following single short-term exposures lasting 2 to 5 hours and in PM concentrations corresponding to the peak concentrations of about 120 microgram per meter cubed and above. However, air quality analyses that are completed in the draft policy assessment indicate that 2-hour ambient concentrations at these levels rarely occur in areas that are meeting the current standards. This evidence suggests that the current standards provide protection against these short-term exposures and provide little support for the need for additional protection above that already provided by the current 24-hour standard. Now, on the other hand, lowering the level of the 24-hour standard could be considered to reduce the typical PM 2.5 exposures and corresponding to the middle portion of air quality. But this generally is not the most effective approach when aimed at national scale reductions. So at this point, I'd like to pass the microphone to my colleague, Nicole Hagan.
Great, thanks so much, Lars. We'll move to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit with you about the preliminary conclusions in the draft policy assessment associated with the primary PM10 standard. I first want to note that the primary PM10 standard is intended to protect against exposures to PM10 minus 2.5 or coarse PM. Therefore, the draft PA focuses on the health effects evidence for coarse particulate matter. The 2019 ISA concludes that the available scientific evidence supports causality determinations that are suggestive of, but not sufficient to infer, a causal relationship for mortality and cardiovascular effects associated with both long and short-term PM10 minus 2.5 exposures, respiratory effects and short-term exposures, and cancer, nervous system effects, and metabolic effects and long-term exposures. As mentioned earlier today by Jason during his presentation, the draft ISA supplement focused on the health effects evidence where the health effects categories in the 2019 ISA concluded that a causal relationship exists. Therefore, the draft ISA supplement does not include an evaluation of additional studies for PM 2.5 related health effects. The 2019 ISA serves as the scientific foundation for the reconsideration of the primary PM10 standard, and the draft PA draws heavily from the 2020 PA in reaching preliminary conclusions on this standard. Next slide, please. The epidemiologic studies assessed in the 2019 ISA reported positive associations between PM10 minus 2.5 exposures and mortality and morbidity, and expanded and strengthened the evidence for some of the outcome categories since the completion of the 2009 ISA. However, we do note that a number of uncertainties persist with the evidence that resulted in the 2019 ISA conclusions that the strongest evidence is suggestive of, but not sufficient to infer causal relationships for PM10 minus 2.5 and health effects. Specifically, the uncertainties associated with the evidence include a lack of systematic evaluation or comparison of exposure estimation methods for PM10 minus 2.5 in the epidemiologic studies, a limited examination of co-pollutant models in the studies, as well as limited support from the experimental evidence for biological plausibility. In considering the evidence that's available from the 2019 ISA, the draft PA notes that while the evidence does support maintaining a PM10 standard that provides some measure of protection against exposures to PM10 minus 2.5, there are some uncertainties that make it unclear about what the potential public health implications would be if the PM10 standard were to be revised. Therefore, the draft policy assessment concludes that the evidence does not call into question the adequacy of the public health protection of the current primary PM10 standard and supports retaining the current standard without revision. Next slide, please. And now we'll walk through the secondary PM, secondary PM standards. So as mentioned a number of times today, in this reconsideration, we are focusing on the protection afforded by the secondary PM standards against visibility effects, climate effects, and materials effects. The ecological effects of PM are being assessed in the ongoing review of the NOx/SOx PM secondary NACs. The 2019 ISA concluded that the evidence supports a causal relationship between PM and visibility effects, climate effects, and materials effects. For the climate and materials effects, the draft ISA supplement does not include an evaluation of studies for these effects. This is based on the fact that the 2020 PA concluded that quantitative analyses could not be completed for climate and materials effects, given that there were such a large number of significant uncertainties associated with the quantitative relationships for PM concentrations and either climate or materials effects. Therefore, The 2019 ISA serves as the scientific foundation for climate and materials effects in the draft PA, and the draft PA draws heavily from the 2020 PA in reaching preliminary conclusions on the secondary standards with regard to PM-related climate and materials effects. Next slide, please. Thank you. For the visibility effects, as mentioned earlier today in Jason's presentation, the draft ISA supplement builds on the evidence from the 2019 ISA and specifically focuses on US and Canadian studies that provide new information on public preferences for visibility impairment, or those studies that developed new methods or conducted quantitative analyses of light extinction. These are the types of studies that have been considered to be of greatest utility in informing the preliminary conclusions on the secondary standards with regard to visibility effects. The draft PA relies on the 2019 ISA and draft ISA supplement as the scientific foundation for visibility effects, and also considers updated quantitative analyses of visibility impairment similar to those that were conducted in past reviews. We consider the scientific information and the quantitative information together in reaching our preliminary conclusions regarding the adequacy of the secondary standards for visibility effects in this reconsideration. Next slide, please. So the draft PA evaluates visual air quality in terms of a 3-year visibility metric, and this is consistent with similar analyses that were completed in past reviews. The draft PA identifies 30 deciviews, which is a measure of visual air quality, as the target level of protection for the 3-year visibility metric, which is the same as the target level of protection identified in both the 2012 and 2020 reviews. And that target level of protection is based on studies of public preferences of acceptable levels of visibility impairment. There is some new information regarding public preferences of visibility impairment available since the completion of the 2019 ISA, but those studies provide limited information about the public preferences of visibility impairment or specific quantitative analyses that would inform alternative approaches to quantitatively assessing visibility impairment and public preferences as a part of the draft policy assessment. For the quantitative analyses included in the draft PA, some of the newer information that's included to support those analyses include recent air quality for the 2017 to 2019 time period. There are also 60 geographically distributed areas across the US. There's spatially refined relative humidity data. We estimate light extinction using 3 versions of the improve equation, which is consistent with the approach taken in the 2020 policy assessment. And in this draft policy assessment, all 60 areas included in the analyses had monitoring data for coarse particulate matter available for input into the improve equations. So the figure on the right shows the 3-year visibility metric on the y-axis with a dashed line at the 30 deciview target level of protection compared to the current 24-hour PM 2.5 standard with its level of 35 micrograms per cubic meter on the x-axis. And in this specific example, light extinction was calculated using the original improve equation, which is just one of the 3 that we used in these quantitative analyses. Overall, the findings in the draft PA are consistent with past reviews. As you can see in the figure, for all 60 areas, when light extinction is calculated using the original improve equation, all of the areas have a 3-year visibility metric below 30 deciviews. In those areas that meet the current 24-hour PM 2.5 standard, which is the bottom left quadrant in the figure, all of the areas were at or below 26 deciviews for the 3-year visibility metric. In the 4 areas that exceeded the current 24-hour standard, which is the bottom right quadrant in this figure, light extinction estimates ranged from 22 to 29 deciviews. And across all 60 areas included in the analysis, the average 3-year visibility metric was 20 deciviews. Next slide, please. In reaching preliminary conclusions regarding the secondary PM standards, we first note that generally the scientific evidence for visibility, climate, and materials effects that's available in the reconsideration is consistent with the evidence that was available in the 2012 and 2020 reviews, including the uncertainties associated with that evidence. For visibility, the updated quantitative analyses in the draft PA suggest that all 60 areas meet the target level of protection for the 3-year visibility metric of 30 deciviews, including the 56 areas that meet the current 24-hour PM 2.5 standard and the 4 areas that exceed the current 24-hour PM 2.5 standard. So taking this information together and considering the uncertainties associated with it as well, the draft policy assessment reaches the preliminary conclusion that the available evidence and quantitative information do not call into question the adequacy of the protection provided by the current secondary PM standards, and preliminarily concludes that this information supports retaining the current secondary standards without revision. And with that, I will turn it over to Karen to walk through the charge.
Thank you, Nicole. So next slides, the next set of slides just include our charge questions to CASAC. We don't need to talk about them in a lot of detail, but just very quickly, in the policy assessment, chapter 1 is a general introduction with some information and background on the history of the NAAQS review. Chapter 2 touches on air quality, trends and relationships, and this is where you will find the quantitative analyses looking at the relationships between different mean metrics for PM2.5 and the primary design values. Next slide shows the chapter 3, which focuses on the reconsideration of the primary standards for PM2.5. And in particular, the questions are aiming at asking for your input on our approach, our decision framework, and the preliminary conclusions. Next slide shows the charge questions for chapter 4, which are, there are a lot of charge questions on chapter 3, are for chapter 4, and showing the charge questions on with respect to the primary standard of PM10. And then lastly, on the last slide, you can see the charge questions that we have with respect to chapter 5, which focuses on reconsideration of the secondary standards for PM. And with that, I will stop, and we're happy to take questions, and I'll hand it back to Dr. Shepard.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was very helpful. I want to invite panel members to ask your clarifying questions. So Mark has a question.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So great presentations, thanks for that. So this question is a little bit along the lines of Dr. Ziegler's earlier about the causal modeling approaches. I'm also unfamiliar with this term of accountability studies that keeps coming up. Could you explain a little bit more what that is meant to confer and what those are?
Sure, I'll let Lars cover that question. I think he can describe those in more detail. Lars.
Yeah, so with respect to the causal modeling studies, you know, we use the ISA supplement and the ISA as a resource to pull studies. And so I think it was a great question earlier of what's the definition of a causal modeling study, but we remain consistent with the ISA supplement and the ISA, the 2019 ISA. With respect to accountability studies, the accountability studies are really looking at a specific, not necessarily an intervention in some terms, but for example, whether or not the 2005 PM NAAQS implementation rule led to air quality improvements before and after, and led to associated public health improvements. And so more specifically, some of these studies will look at starting, when I say starting, their prior concentration is below 12. Then they go through like a NAAQS implementation rule, for example, and then they look at the ending concentration. And so they're really assessing whether or not there is an associated air quality improvement and an associated health benefit from a starting concentration to an ending concentration.
Oh, okay, thank you. I think that clarifies it.
Thank you. Michelle Bell.
Hi, thank you so much for these really thoughtful and informative presentations. I have a question that references some of the slides that Elizabeth shared, but maybe you or someone else may want to answer this question. So I really appreciated when you're looking at the environmental justice issues by race that both differences in levels of exposure were looked at, as well as the impacts of differences in the concentration health response. So thank you so much for doing that. My question is, when you look at that different simulations, did you also look at not just changes in the overall level of, say, mortalities, but changes in the disparity? I wasn't able to really tell from the figure if under different simulations, if air pollution is improving for everyone, if the gap between, let's say, white and Black populations is getting smaller or getting larger or staying the same. Thank you.
Yes, so we, of course, we're limited to a very short synopsis of the results in these presentations, but we do look at exactly that. We include the percent reduction for each, and then the proportion, so that we can see what the baseline reduction is in each demographic. So we can see a slightly greater reduction in Black populations than white populations when moving to different potential alternative standards. Another way to answer your question is that we used race and ethnicity stratified concentration response functions. So part of the increased risk we're seeing in certain demographic populations is due to the different concentration response relationship. We are also bringing into the equation differences in baseline mortality incidence rates. So those, but overall, the impact of the concentration response functions is, basically washes out or overwhelms the impact of the baseline incidence rates. But we do show those split out as well, the impacts of each.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you. We have a question from Jim Boylan.
Hi, Jim Boylan here. So this question is again about the risk assessment, particularly on page 15 under the conclusions. You have a number of deaths avoided and things like that and percentages. I guess I was confused. Maybe you could explain, if the standard was lowered from 12 to 10, how many deaths would be avoided? Is that included in that summary or is that not?
You're muted, Elizabeth.
Thank you for that. The upwards of 45,000 number is the total mortality burden under the current standard. We do assess the mortality risk reduction in the 47 areas when moving from one standard, the current standard, to potential alternative standards. And I can look up what those numbers are, but they're, of course, much smaller.
So the death burden is assuming all those areas are right at 12 micrograms per cubic meter, including, and I know some of those areas are above 12 already, but a lot of them are already below 12, so they could be at 10.1. And so you're assuming that they increase their PM to get up to 12 and then look at the number of deaths. And then as you lower the standard down to 10, you say that those are deaths avoided, but in reality, they're not really deaths avoided because the areas are already close to 10 already. So I'm trying to understand how to use this information.
So I think that Jim might want to tack on to this with the air quality modeling aspect, and Karen might want to add on as well with regard to the purpose of the policy assessment in general. But I will say we didn't raise every
grid cell up to 12. We raised the design value monitors up or down to 12, just meeting 12 annually and 35 daily. So it's not necessarily a uniform exposure. And then with regards to how to interpret these data, it has to do with the max being the allowable highest concentrations. So yeah, I'll let Karen take that.
Jim, I think that's a good question. And we always, struggle with this question a little bit, but I think you're familiar with some of the other reviews. Generally, we're trying to answer the question of what is the risk attributable to the current standard. And so while it is true that an area may be at 11, it is also true that that area has the ability to go up to 12 and still be in attainment. And so what we're looking at is not necessarily will that happen? We are looking at if that standard is at 12, what is the risk associated with that standard? So when you look at these numbers, you should interpret it with that lens. EPA also does a regulatory impact assessment, and in doing that assessment, that's done when we propose. Those assessments are much more specific, so and much more detailed in that the analysis goes in and looks at current conditions as a starting point and assesses risk, and then looks at adjustments associated with actual controls. So there's a lot of things in a REA that aren't as specific and as real life as are incorporated in an RIA. And so those are the differences between those types of analyses. So keep that lens on when you think about interpreting the values associated with the risk assessment we've been talking about here.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the clarification. I mean, I think, real lives versus imaginary lives, it's something that should be understood, what we're talking about here. So I appreciate the clarification.
Yeah, if I could just chime in, this is Erica. If I can just chime in really quickly, I think we have to remember that the risk assessment is answering a different question than the RIA. So Karen referenced these two different assessments. The risk assessment is trying to help us answer the question of whether the current standard is requisite. Is it providing sufficient public health protection? So we look at allowable risk at the level of the standard. And you're right that that's in some ways a fictitious metric, but it is the question that we are looking at in trying to decide whether the current standards are adequate. The regulatory impact analysis is looking at, given a starting point, given a reality in the world, what would it cost us to reach attainment with a different standard? But that's a totally different question.
So we're not looking at, if we were to lower the standard, how many lives would be saved? We're not looking at that in this document. Is that correct?
We're looking at it from the perspective of what's allowed by the current standard versus what would be allowed under an alternative. In either case, the actual air quality might vary somewhat because that standard is measured on peak monitor. So we have to consider the full distribution of risk that's allowed by the current standard.
Okay, I appreciate the clarification. Thank you.
Thank you. Move on to Judy Chow.
Hi, thank you. I have a different question that apparently major efforts has been made to assess a PM 2.5. And if someone recall that in 2006, it was a PM core standard, a PM 10 minus 2.5 standard was proposed. And that make a lot of sense because property composition, source origin of PM 2.5, PM 10, PM 2.5 and PM core is quite different, and different strategy or control measures should be placed for two different properties. My question is that, have EPA reconsidered or consider to the establishment of the PM 10 minus 2.5 standard? And because very little attention has been made, except PM course was mentioned in the input formula, that's about, and very little attention has been made on PM course property or the health effect.
So thank you, Judy, for that question. It is one that I think that we can talk about probably in more detail in December when we have the full team at the table with respect to the monitoring networks and et cetera. But I will just preliminary say, and then pass it to Nicole for any more details, that the evidence itself with respect to the PM 10 minus 2.5 effects has been challenging with respect to interpreting the adequacy of the standard. And for some of the reasons that Nicole stepped through, some of the uncertainties there have not suggested that we need to move in that direction. So let me hand it off to Nicole to provide any more details on that.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I don't think I have very much more to add at this point. I mean, we do outline some additional areas where research could evolve to help inform our understanding of the coarse PM related health effects and build on the information that's currently available in the 2019 ISA. And some of those key areas of future research do specifically address some of the uncertainties associated with how those studies measure PM 10 minus 2.5 and how that information translates into the health effects studies. I think, we are evaluating the health effects evidence for coarse PM in considering the primary PM 10 standard. And that standard is intended to provide the protection against the health effects of the coarse fraction. But at this point, the draft policy assessment doesn't conclude that we need a different kind of indicator or a different kind of standard beyond the primary PM10 standard that is currently in place to provide the requisite protection against the health effects of those coarse particles.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions? Jim, I assume your hand's just up from before and you don't have a new question. So I actually had a question about the hybrid models and the averaging. And my question was, are the values that are going into the averaging that you're doing, are they all grid-based values or are they other locations?
So I'll try to answer that, and Jim Kelly or Lars Perlmutt, feel free to add on to that. For the most part, the studies that we're looking at are gridded. And they are incorporating a variety of methods. Some are including, CTMs, the chemical transport models, in capturing the concentrations across a broad area, and then folding those in with monitors or satellites. Some, on the other hand, are not incorporating the chemical transport models, but instead using land use information, emissions information, and folding that information in with monitored information. So I should just say that there are a variety of different models. Not all of the hybrid approaches use gridded models like chemical transport models like CMAC or CAMX, for example. So there's some variation in the technical approaches used in each of those.
And it sounds like, based on your answer, that some of the models are using sort of area-based grid values and other ones are using point-based information.
That's correct. Some interpolate down to like a census tract, for example, starting with information at various scales and informing that. We did, as you'll see in reading the draft policy assessment, we did start with a very large body of studies and narrowed those down to what we considered the key epidemiological studies. And one of the ways that we narrowed it down was to require that the studies have an analysis included that cross-referenced and checked the QA'd the approach. Such that there was a greater level of confidence displayed in the estimates from the hybrid analysis. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't see any additional hands. Is there anybody else that has a clarifying question? Well, it looks like we might actually be able to end a few minutes early from the way things are going. I think before I make closing remarks, I saw that Mark Frampton joined us and he had not had the opportunity to introduce himself, so I wanted to give him that opportunity now. Are you still on, Mark?
I am still on. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Mark Frampton, University of Rochester Medical Center. And sorry I wasn't able to join earlier in the meeting. I had a previous conflict, but glad to be here.
Thank you, Mark. And so I think unless there's any additional questions, I don't see any. I think we will move towards closing the meeting. I want to express my appreciation to everybody who presented today. We've got a really comprehensive overview. We were really fortunate to get the policy level perspective, and it was an honor to hear from Administrator Regan as well as the two deputy assistant administrators. I think that one of the big messages we heard from Administrator Regan was it's a priority to do our work through an environmental justice and equity lens. So I challenge all of us to think about that as we move forward. We got lots of valuable advice from Dr. Frey, and Mr. Goffin emphasized the importance of this PM review process being enormously helpful to the agency. And we had great, thorough, and enormously helpful presentations by both the Office of Research and Development and the Office of Air Research. So I want to thank everybody for all of your contributions and for the panel for your questions. Erin sent out the charge questions today, and I encourage anyone and everyone on the panel to contact me and/or Erin if you wish to discuss anything about the charge questions. As I saw the policy assessment charge questions for the last chapter, I was wondering if we should break those out. So Erin and I will be reflecting on that after the meeting, and I welcome your input on that. Just contact us. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Erin to adjourn the meeting.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you, EPA, for your presentations and all the panel members. We will be in further contact regarding preparations for our November meeting. And just remind the public again, if you would like to register to provide an oral comment on November 17th, to please contact me before November 10th to be added to the list of public speakers. And with that, we can be adjourned. Thank you, everyone.